Chapter 31. Calm down. Pretend nothing's wrong. So the bitch went to Gerald, so what? It was inevitable. As are the police. And things are only going to get worse when they find the other one. Glancing down at the screen of his GPS tracking system, he realized that Acacia had driven home from Gerald's company in Missoula, which was exactly what he'd expected. And yet he couldn't help but worry, his hands sweaty in gloves, his teeth sinking into his lower lip as he thought of everything that could go wrong. He'd been so diligent. He was on the move again. There was just so much to do, and time was his enemy. He'd switched license plates on the truck, just in case, putting on the set of stolen Idaho plates. His windshield wipers wiped off the snow, as he thought about yesterday and how he'd surprised another one. She had been cross-country skiing on a trail that was one of her usual haunts. He'd had to wait several days in the empty parking lot, hoping she would appear. Finally, yesterday, as he'd pretended to be checking his own equipment, the nose of her Honda appeared. After she'd parked, she'd geared up and he'd offered a hand in greeting as she'd snapped on her skis and taken off. He'd waited until she was around the bend and through a copse of pine before he'd taken off after her, his strides strong and swift. She was athletic, and he was surprised how long it had taken to catch up to her. But he'd kept her red jacket in the line of his vision until she'd started up the incline that ran along the creek. He'd accelerated then, pushing himself, feeling the cold wind permeate his ski mask as it rattled the trees. Swoosh! His skis skimmed over the thick powder. He dug his poles into the soft snow with smooth, sure regularity, and gained on her. She was 30 feet ahead of him and gliding through the sparse stands, her skis smooth near the creek bank, the wires from her iPod now visible. 20 feet. Up another short incline. Perfect. He dug in, pushing harder, sweating, closing the distance between them. 10 feet. Behind his ski mask, he grinned. She hadn't heard him, didn't know he was following. So into her music and the beauty of the fresh snow in the wilderness, or some such crap, she skied innocently, unaware. Closer still. Now the tips of his skis were nearly touching the backs of hers. They were heading into a thicker grove, where birch and pine quivered with the wind. One gnarly pine, with a thick trunk and several broken branches, caught his eye. Perfect. As she curved around the bend in the creek, he pulled up beside her. They were skiing two abreast. She caught a glimpse of him because just as the tree with its broken branches loomed, she flinched. She turned her head, eyes round in fear, mouth pulled back to scream, as he shoved her, hard, into the rotting pine. Now, as he remembered the horror on her face, the sickening sound of her body slamming into the bark, the thud of her head cracking against that jagged, protruding, broken branch, he grinned again. One less unknowing walking the earth. And now, he thought, bringing himself up to the minute, he would take care of the one that he should have dealt with years before. His scar seemed to throb as the wipers swatted away the snow, and some inane Christmas song rolled through the speakers. "Three kings, my ass," he muttered, and he felt that little zing sizzle through his blood, that spark of anticipation, as he thought of what was to come. Acacia. God, he'd like to fuck her. Just to show her what he could do. Then again, he'd settle for killing her. Watching her eyes widen in surprise when she recognized him, seeing her pupils dilate in terror, witnessing her understanding that he would snuff the life from her. He felt his cock twitch and stiffen. With a moan he let out his breath slowly, loosening his fingers as they gripped the wheel. He had to park out of sight again, in Snowshoe Inn, which was perfect, and the falling snow would make an excellent cover. Get rid of his tracks. Smiling, he drove into the foothills. He knew just the right spot. "So that's it?" Alvarez said into the hands-free device of her cell phone as she drove. "Black paint that you can buy anywhere?" "Sorry," Gus said without an ounce of apology in his voice. "It is what it is, and what it is premium flat black number 308. It's been the same formula for nearly 15 years. They were talking about the paint marks retrieved from Ellie Alexander's van, and instead of the paint that was transferred belonging to a certain make and model of car, it was from a spray paint can, the kind that could be bought all across the country and was used to paint anything from outdoor furniture to model cars or barbecues. Great. "Hey, I gave you what I had." "I know. Thanks, Gus." She hung up and considered how many stores in the Grizzly Falls area had sold that particular brand in the past 15 years. Would they get lucky and find someone who had purchased it lately? And what if the paint had been bought in Spokane, or Boise, or Missoula, or who knew where? At least she had the information on the coffee grounds. Alvarez was alone. Pescoli had received a call from Jeremy just as they were leaving. He'd told her that Chris Schultz was over, so she'd had to head home again. Alvarez had told her not to bother returning, but Pescoli had made it clear she would deal with the matter, and show up as soon as she could. It seemed Pescoli had been half annoyed, half glad that Jeremy had decided to rat out his sister's boyfriend. It was almost a sign of maturity. Alvarez found Acacia Lambert's address and turned into the long drive that led to the house, following a couple of sets of fresh tracks. To her unwelcome surprise, Trace O'Halloran was waiting for her as she pulled up beside his truck. The tech crew had already arrived as well, parked to the side of the garage. One of the guys, Rudy, was outside the department-issued van, smoking a cigarette and talking to Trace. Rudy's partner, Eileen, was inside the vehicle, keeping warm as the van's engine idled, exhaust fogging in the air. Alvarez considered Trace. He wasn't the killer. His alibis had proved that. But he was in this thing up to his sexy eyeballs. She just hadn't quite figured out how. Yet. What was it with him and the women who might just have been all sired by donor 727? There was no time like the present to find out. As she opened the door of her Jeep, she heard another vehicle in the drive and saw the play of headlights in the snow. Seconds later, Dr. Acacia Lambert herself had parked her car in the drive, behind Alvarez, and had walked over the mashed snow to the group, just as Eileen climbed out of the van. They discussed the plan to sweep the house. They were to find the bugs, try to locate the exterior source, but leave everything as it was. Casey and Trace would talk as if they were the only ones in the house, catch up on the day, while the techs combed each room for listening devices, and perhaps cameras. Afterward, they would dust for prints. Clearly, Casey had been hoping the mics would be immediately removed, and Alvarez couldn't blame her. But she saw the wisdom of keeping them in place, and so they all headed toward the house. If Trace had made a mistake, and there were actually cameras in the house as well, they were screwed and would tip off whoever had bugged the house. Then again, if the guy was nearby, there was a chance he would see them anyway, and probably figure out that they were onto him. Even though the house sat back from the road, he could have an observation point. They made their way to the back porch, but stopped short when a deep-throated dog started barking from within. "Hey, Bonds, it's me, hush," Casey ordered, but the animal kept up the ruckus until she was inside. Only then did his hackles lower and his tail began wagging in wide arcs as he happily greeted everyone. Though he looked as if he were aggressive with predominantly pit bull genes, he lowered his head like a gentleman and waited to be petted by everyone filing inside. Casey let him outside, then fed him near the back door before heading into the den as planned. While Rudy and Eileen worked, Trace and Casey turned on several televisions to mask some of the noise, then played their roles in the den. Alvarez snapped on a pair of latex gloves, collected some of the coffee grounds, as well as the beans still in the canister and grinder, and placed them all in plastic bags. She didn't expect to find any fingerprints from whoever had planted the bugs, but she believed in being thorough. Who knew? They might get lucky. Finding the evidence that the creep was targeting Acacia Lambert, playing with her, listening in on her life, went a long way to proving her theory that the deaths were connected. Could Acacia Lambert also be the progeny of donor 727? Alvarez planned on asking the woman, but was waiting till this debugging was over. While Casey and Trace played their parts at the computer in the den, the dog curled at Casey's feet. Alvarez scratched out a quick question on a pad, then placed it in front of the doctor. "Have you been feeling ill?" Trace O'Halloran frowned, looked from one woman to the other. Casey hesitated and frowned. She wrote back, "Stomach." Alvarez wrote back, "Maybe poison. Arsenic found in Wallace's stomach contents." "From what?" Casey mouthed. Alvarez wrote, "In the coffee. Most likely a small dosage." "Damn it." Casey's voice was barely discernible. Probably wouldn't be picked up on the mic. Her expression turned from concern to anger, and she wrote quickly, "We need to talk." Nodding, Alvarez scribbled back, "My car." She then turned up the television to the point that nothing else could be heard, and carrying the coffee pot and grinder, all bagged and tagged, walked through the kitchen and outside. The wind was blowing hard, snow slanting sideways at times, a tree branch banging against one of the gutters on the second story. She unlocked her car and climbed in. Trace and Casey showed up a few moments later. "Okay, it's safe here," Alvarez said, as she turned on the engine and ignored any banter or crackling on the radio. Trace was stretched across the back, Casey in the passenger bucket seat. Alvarez adjusted the heater to blow out the condensation, then let the wipers swipe off an accumulation of snow. "I think you may have been poisoned, though probably not more than enough to make you sick. And the reason I think so is because we found traces of arsenic in Jocelyn's blood. The guy was toying with her. He'd put it into her coffee somehow." "Sick bastard," Trey said. "You think he put it in my coffee too?" Casey asked. "I'll find out." "I think this sick bastard could be related to me," Casey said, slowly, picking her words. "How so?" Alvarez asked. Casey then, somewhat reluctantly, launched into a story about being the love child of her mother and one Gerald Johnson, a doctor who had invented a certain type of heart stent. She told of her findings that afternoon in Missoula, at Gerald's place of work, summing up her impressions of him and his children, then dropped the bomb that Gerald Johnson, as a medical student, had been a sperm donor to a now-defunct clinic. Alvarez took a long moment, savoring the feeling of a case breaking wide open. "We were already on the sperm bank angle," she told Casey, surprising both her and Trace. "From Ellie Alexander's parents." Quickly she recapped what she'd learned, then gazed at Casey seriously across the dark interior of the car. "But you have to cease and desist. Give me a statement back at the station, then disappear, hide out. At least until we determine if you're a target and what the story is with Johnson and his kids. One of them is like me, Robert Lindley. His mother was another of Johnson's mistresses, and another one of his children, a girl named Kathleen, died in her 20s in a skiing accident." "Another accident," Alvarez said. "You think she was a victim?" Trace asked. "Maybe." "But what about his other kids?" Casey asked. "Kathleen died years ago, and Agatha when she was 8. The rest of them, as far as I know, haven't had any brushes with death." "That's just it, as far as you know. For now, though, you have to quit playing detective. It's too dangerous." Alvarez was adamant. "It's our job. We'll handle it from here." "Jesus," Pescoli muttered, stunned as she knelt on the snow near the corpse, a cross-country skier who had apparently slammed into the snag of a pine tree perched on the banks of the icy creek. Pescoli had been on her way to the Lambert house when she'd gotten the call. The dead skier was a woman with reddish hair, and though her face was mangled from her crash with the pine, and blood had frozen over a shattered cheekbone and eye socket, Pescoli felt a shiver of dread run through her. The accident victim's features, though discolored and frozen, were similar to those of Jocelyn Wallace, Ellie Alexander, and even Shelley Bonaventure. "Son of a bitch," she said, as the body was photographed, then bagged and driven to the medical examiner's van, which was parked in the lower lot next to the red Honda, which was registered to Carolee Rearson, who lived 10 miles east. What were the chances? She spent time talking to the couple who had found her, newly married 20-somethings who had been snowshoeing and happened upon the dead body. They'd nearly missed seeing her as she'd been half buried in snow, but the man caught a glimpse of something red beneath the fresh snow, and investigated. They had been terrified, but, having cell phones with them, had called 911. Kay and Rule had taken the call and been dispatched to the scene. When he'd seen the victim, he in turn had phoned the station again, requesting a homicide detective. Pescoli had been the detective closest, and she'd driven her jeep up to the lower lot and snowshoed in a quarter-mile to the area where the victim had lost her life, in an apparent accident. The crime scene crew had arrived and was combing the area for trace evidence, but Pescoli figured they wouldn't find much. The weapon of death was the tree. Bloodstains on a particularly vicious eye-level snag were still visible. It could have been an accident, she supposed. A careless or startled skier, maybe. But Pescoli wasn't buying it for a minute. She figured that the dead woman now on her way to the morgue would prove to be yet another victim of a killer who had a vendetta against the offspring of donor 727. Whoever the hell he was. No, the killer was even more precise in his intentions than that. So far, all the victims had been women. Ellie Alexander's brother, Bruce, was alive and well, according to her parents. A mistake? Probably not. Now, as she snowshoed back to her jeep and waited for the truck to come and tow Carolee Rearson's little Honda, she flipped open her cell phone and called Alvarez. When her partner didn't answer, Pescoli left a short message. "I think we've got another one." Then watched as the frozen Honda, with snow piled over its hood and dirty icicles dangling like long, snaggy teeth along the wheel wells, was winched onto the flatbed. Another accident. Another dead woman. Probably related to good old 727. Whatever the hell that meant. Chapter 32. Poisoned? She had been poisoned, and she hadn't even realized it? With Trace at her side, Casey was seated on a folding chair in the interview room at the sheriff's department, while listening to Alvarez from the other side of the small battered table describe finding arsenic in Jocelyn Wallace's coffee grounds. Casey thought of her own symptoms, how she'd never considered that there was a toxin running through her veins. She was a doctor, and she would have noticed if the symptoms had become violent, the pain more intense. Still, it all made sense. Now. Already the interview was well into its second hour. Detective Alvarez, after warning them to stay out of the investigation, was now doing this by the book. Trace, though he tried to appear relaxed, was antsy, his jaw, beneath the darkening beard shadow, tight, his lips flat, his eyes serious. Twice during the conversation, he'd stepped outside the room to call Tilly and get an update on his son. Though he didn't really need to be here, and Casey had encouraged him to go home, he'd stayed. Alvarez had listened to Casey's theory about the dead women being related to Gerald Johnson twice so far, once at Casey's house and a second time now. When her partner Pescoli arrived, Alvarez quickly brought her up to speed. "Gerald Johnson," Pescoli repeated, shaking her head. "Think this is his work, too?" She offered up pictures that looked as if they had been taken digitally, then printed out. Casey inwardly cringed as she looked at the graphic images Not so much from the woman's injuries, she'd seen worse in medical school, and her practice, but because of what she saw beyond the battered, bloody features. The victim's hair, poking out of a blood-encrusted cap, was a deep red-brown, as close to Casey's own color as it could be, and the one eye that was open, pupil apparently fixed, was a green shade that wasn't quite as blue as her own, but was definitely in the color spectrum of all the victims. Had her face not been so battered, this woman too would have resembled Casey enough as to have been her sister, which, she thought sadly, was probably true. "You know her?" Alvarez asked. Casey shook her head. "I don't think I've ever seen her in my life." "I was talking to him." Alvarez hitched her chin toward Trace, her dark eyes holding his. His jaw was clamped shut, and irritation caused a muscle to work in his jaw. "No." He slid the pictures back toward Pescoli, who was still standing near the table. Casey asked, "Who is she?" Pescoli thought for a moment and said, "I guess we can tell you, considering the situation, but keep it to yourselves. Next of kin is being notified as we speak. Her name is Carolee Rearson. She's local, a nurse, divorced a couple of times, no kids, lived in Oregon for a while." She paused a moment as if thinking things over, then said, "She grew up in Helena." "Dear God," Casey whispered, sick inside. "Who was behind all these accidents? Why was he killing?" "Dr. Lambert went to see Gerald Johnson today," Alvarez said, then nodded to Casey, who explained again about getting her mother to come up with the truth, then forcing herself on Gerald Johnson and his family. "Did you go see Johnson and his clan to try and flush out the killer?" Pescoli asked, her expression stern. She stood leaning against the far wall, below a camera mounted near the ceiling. "I actually went to meet them, show them the pictures, tell them what I knew. I wanted to see their expressions, especially Gerald's, as he seems to be the link to all of this." She felt cold inside again, just remembering his reaction and those of her half-siblings. Though she didn't really know them, she realized she would never be close to any of them, might, in fact, never see them again. Her curiosity was satisfied, though. As far as she was concerned, they weren't part of her family. Gerald was concerned when I showed him the pictures of the dead women, and even though I don't think he wanted to, he owned up to the whole sperm donor thing, which bothered most of his kids. "I'd say," Pescoli muttered. "From now on, stay away from them," Alvarez advised. Trace asked, "You think they're dangerous?" "I think it's police business," Pescoli was firm. "Not that we don't appreciate the fact that you found out who our sperm donor is. We only had a number." They discussed the meeting with the Johnson clan, and then Casey told the detectives about Gloria Sanders O'Malley, the instructor at Fit Forever. "She looks like the rest of us, and she was born in Helena." "I've seen her at the gym," Alvarez said, her expression growing tense. "She does resemble the others." "For the love of God, how many victims and potential victims are we talking about?" Pescoli broke in. "This is nuts." She shook her head. "I'm sorry, go on." "Once I figured out there were more people like me, those with Gerald Johnson as a father. I went to meet him, see what he was like. I wasn't sure I'd meet his kids, but once Clarissa barged into his office and figured out who I was, they called a family meeting." "You should have come here first," Pescoli said. "What would I have come with? Some half-baked theory about people who looked like me getting killed off? A few days ago I didn't even know that Stanley Collins wasn't my biological father." The newfound anger and sense of betrayal that had been with her ever since her mother's confession still burned bright. "You know of any other potential victims?" Alvarez asked. "I have a friend looking through state files. I'm not going to give up their name," she said, instinctively covering for Riza. "And I believe from what I've learned that there may have been others already killed. It's as if the guy started out years ago working in a wide circle, then slowly tightened it until he's now concentrating here, in this corner of Montana. From as far away as Detroit to all along the West Coast, Seattle and San Francisco, women have been having accidents. I haven't had time to look into them all, but I've got names and addresses and dates of death. Reaching into her purse, she found a manila envelope that contained the information from Riza. She slid it across the table toward Alvarez, but she didn't take her fingers off the end of the envelope closest to her. Alvarez frowned and placed her fingers on the other side of the envelope. Inside the envelope were copies without any information about Riza or the state offices from which they came. But it would be a simple enough matter for the police, if they were so inclined, to figure out where they had come from, and a simple search into Casey's background and her schooling would connect her to Riza. She had to come clean. A friend of mine risked their job for this. You have to promise me that they won't get into any kind of trouble. None. This is a sheriff's department investigation, Pescoli reminded everyone in the room. Casey held fast to the envelopes. Women are dying. As far as I know, no men have been killed, which is really odd, since Gerald Johnson has fathered a number of males, too. No one will lose their job or get into serious trouble, Alvarez promised. And Casey let go of the envelope. I'm going to have someone get right on this, Pescoli said, and left the room quickly. Alvarez continued the interview. When she asked if Casey had ever felt stalked, or if things were strange, Casey was reminded again of the attack in Seattle, and mentioned it. Then she remembered the accident and Grace Purchant's warning. This is probably nothing, she said. But I was in an accident, or almost an accident. Less than a fender bender. The roads were icy, and another car lost control. I had to swerve to miss it, and when I did, I slid into the other lane. A big truck, going the opposite direction, clipped my bumper. It seemed like on purpose. Even though it was obviously my fault, the other driver took off, rather than stop and swap insurance information. Alvarez, who was taking notes, asked, "You didn't get a look at the driver?" "Just a quick glimpse, but other than seeing it was a man with dark hair, no." Casey shook her head and, out of her peripheral vision, saw Trace tense, the muscles in his neck tighten. For the most part, his face was averted. I had the impression I'd seen him before, but I couldn't place him. He did look like some of Gerald Johnson's sons I met today, but I might be pushing that. Alvarez asked, "Do you know the make or model of the truck?" I was too busy trying to stay on the road. It was big, probably domestic, Chevy or Ford, I think, but I'm not sure. What I did notice was that it had a huge bumper guard of some kind on it. Looked like it was steel, but painted black, and even though I didn't get a good look at the plates, I had a feeling that they weren't from Montana. One of the numbers was either a 3 or an 8, or maybe it was a B. The back plate was really dirty, and there wasn't time to get a second look. It all happened in just a few seconds. "Any chance there was some paint transfer from his vehicle to yours?" Alvarez asked, suddenly more interested. "Maybe. I saw black marks and a bit of a dent on my bumper." "We'd like to keep your car. Try and get at some of those black marks. See if they're paint." Alvarez was all business. "Is there anything else you remember?" "Not really." "Oh, but there was a witness," Casey said. Why hadn't she thought of this before? Because it was random. You didn't really think the accident was connected to anything else. The driver hadn't intentionally tried to run you down, she thought. Now, though... Grace Purchant. She was out walking her dog, the one that's part wolf. Did you talk to her? Grace's warning ran like blood through Casey's brain. You should never speak to him. He is evil. He means you harm. She tried to dismiss the pale woman's message, but it had stuck with her, invaded her dreams. She told me not to try and chase him down, that the driver was evil. When I asked her who he was, she couldn't come up with a name, just that he meant me harm. Sounds like Grace, Alvarez said. We'll check it out. Fishing in her purse, Casey came up with her keyring, then removed the key to her Ford and handed it to Alvarez. "I'll need the car back soon." "Tomorrow," Alvarez promised, scooting back in her chair, indicating the interview was finally over. "And I'll get hold of Grace Perchant." Trace had listened to most of the interview without saying too much, but as the discussion had worn on, he'd become more and more concerned for Casey's safety. After learning that she had possibly been poisoned, and then viewing Pescoli's gruesome pictures of Carolee Rearson, the most recent accident victim, he'd made up his mind. As he held the glass door open for her, then followed her outside, he said, "You're coming to my place." "Oh, I am?" Outside the snow was thick now, still falling, a wind blowing off the mountains. Night had fallen in earnest while they were in the police station. Streetlights glowed, offering a thin blue light to the powdery landscape. "You're sure as hell not going home alone, dog or no dog?" "Yeah?" she asked. But even in the semi-darkness, he saw that she was teasing, her eyes a deeper green. Turning the collar of her coat against the wind, she followed a trail of footprints along a footpath leading past a flagpole, where chains rattled and the flags had already been taken down for the night. As Trace jogged to catch up with her, he noticed snowflakes settling onto her shoulders, sparkling like glitter in the dark strands of her hair. "I don't like what's going on," he said seriously. "Me neither." "So no arguments?" She studied him for a second. "None from me, but we have to pick up my dog and a few things, and then, in the morning, I'm going to need a way to get to work. I think I can handle it. My neighbors Tilly and Ed Zukov are watching over things at my place until I get back." During Trace's last conversation, Tilly had assured him that Ed had taken care of the horses and cattle, and she was already frying chicken. Trace had heard the sizzle of the meat cooking and the blare of the television, as Ed was more than a little hard of hearing. Satisfied that his son was safe and feeling well enough to ask Tilly to bake him brownies, Trace had relaxed a little. But his sense of ease had been short-lived, as the interview had worn on. He didn't know who was behind the accidents of the women who'd died, but the fact that Casey looked like a target was enough to convince him that she shouldn't be alone. Someone had gotten into her house without forced entry, had possibly poisoned her, was privy to her private conversations, and knew when she was alone. Trace's back muscles tightened just at the thought of someone listening in. Was it possible that the person behind the surveillance equipment was the killer? You bet. In Trace's mind there was no question, none whatsoever. He unlocked the truck, waited as she climbed into the cab, then closed the door. She smiled at him through the passenger window, and he felt that now familiar little tug on his heart that he felt whenever he was around her. In another time and place, he might think he was falling in love. Right here, right now, he couldn't even go there. Not while women who looked like her were dying. As he slid behind the wheel, she voiced second thoughts. "I don't know if staying with you is the answer," she said. "Eli would love it." "That's not what I'm thinking about." She slid a glance his way. "And you know it." He realized suddenly how close the cab of his truck was, how their breaths had fogged the glass. Yeah. To break the mood, he flipped on the defrost. He jammed the truck into reverse, backed out of the parking spot, then switched gears to drive. Slowing so that he could ease into the steady stream of traffic heading out of the town, he inched forward, fitting her gaze upon him as he slid into a spot behind a flatbed truck with a load of Christmas trees. "It's just that I have to know that you're safe, okay? So I want you to stay with me." "You want to protect me?" "Something like that." She half smiled, and it was about the sexiest gesture he had ever seen. "You know what, O'Halloran? Maybe I'll end up protecting you. Or something like that." "I want to surprise Gerald Johnson and see what he has to say for himself," Pescoli said as she and Alvarez walked to her office. "Okay, I was doing some research earlier. Let's follow up some more and then take it to Grayson, so he can contact the FBI. FBI my ass, Pescoli muttered. Alvarez grabbed up the information she'd already pulled from the internet, and then she and Pescoli spent time searching for other women born 25 to 40 years earlier in Helena who died accidentally. There was a raft of them, but they chose about a dozen. "This is just so bizarre," Alvarez said. "Beyond bizarre. There are a lot more to sift through. If this is our guy, he sure as hell got around. Which means he had money and free time." They looked at each other. "One of Gerald Johnson's kids?" Pescoli asked. "Not the youngest. He would have only been 6 when the first fatal accident took place. Unless the first accidents really are accidents, or aren't our lookalikes. These deaths really started piling up around 15 years ago. About the time the youngest of Johnson's kids, the twins, were 22, which is about the same time they would have graduated from college if they went. And ended up on Daddy's payroll," Alvarez thought aloud. "But why? And how would whoever it is know where to find the daughters of 727? She grimaced. "Maybe they worked at the clinic while going to college, got the information that way. Could be. Or even bought the information if they found dear old Dad had made regular deposits to the local sperm bank. You know what they say, everything has a price. That includes personal information." Pescoli thought of her own son and his fascination with the Internet. She'd worried that he was playing games and wasting time, or perusing porn. But what if he was hacking, breaking into private files? What do you think? Is anyone in Johnson's family a computer geek? Chapter 33. The roads were a mess. Traffic snarled, the storm relentless as it dumped more snow over northwestern Montana. It took over an hour for Trace and Casey to collect her dog, computer, and an overnight bag. Trace's truck slid twice, but he was able to finally reach the old farmhouse he called home. She'd never seen it before, this big square home perched on a bit of hill, nearly 1/8 of a mile from the county road. Snow was thick on the roof, icicles were dangling from the eaves, and a bitter wind was blowing through the naked trees in a small orchard. Trace pulled into an open garage at the back of the house, where a Dodge pickup, nose facing toward the road, was already parked, 3 inches of snow piled on its hood. Outbuildings stood in the distance, security lamps offering a pale, almost eerie illumination through the curtain of falling snow. As he grabbed Casey's overnight bag, he whistled to her dog, opened the driver's door, and stepped outside. Bonzi scrambled after him, leaping and breaking through a nearly foot of powder, while Casey hauled her computer case up a path broken through the snow. They took 3 steps to a broad back porch, where they tromped the snow off their feet, then stepped through an unlocked back door. Heat and the smell of wood smoke and spices hit them full force as they removed their coats and the dog explored. "Hey there, fella," a deep male voice from somewhere deeper in the house greeted. "Who the hell are you?" There was a sharp bark, and the same voice said, "Hey, Sarge, enough! Looks like you've got a friend here." Then a chuckle. The kitchen was large enough for a full-size table, its butcher block counter pressed up to a wide window overlooking the back porch and the outbuildings beyond. "How's Eli?" Trace asked, as he walked through a wide archway into the living area, where a fire burned in the grate, and a man and woman were seated in front of a television, blasting the news. The woman was knitting. The man had an ear cocked toward the TV set. "He just conked out after dinner," Tilly told Trace, as she stuffed a skein of fuzzy yarn into her bag and gave Casey the once-over. To her husband she yelled, "Ed, turn that thing down, would you? I can't hear myself think." Ed snorted, blinked, and did as he was bid, bringing the noise level down several decibels. A large man, Ed Zukov wouldn't need anything other than a red suit and fake beard to play Santa Claus. Trace made hasty introductions. "Nice to meet you," Tilly said, but there wasn't a lot of warmth in her smile. Ed, though, stood and shook Casey's hand as if he meant it, then settled back into the corner of the couch, his hands fingering the remote control before it slipped off the sectional's arm. Tilly wasn't finished giving Trace a report on his son. "Poor little thing was just plumb tuckered out. Probably the medication," Tilly said. "I think I'll look in on him," Trace said, peeling off his jacket and dashing up a flight of stairs near the front hallway. Sergeant Bonzi followed closely behind. "Nice dog," Ed said. "He yours?" "He is now. I just adopted him." Ed's whitish eyebrows raised. "Guard dog?" "Not much," she smiled. "Hunter?" Ed persisted. Casey shook her head. "Bonzi, I doubt it. Probably we'll never know." As if he'd heard his name, Bonzi came running back down the stairs and bounded past a coffee table to place his head near the armrest of the couch in Ed's hand. "Yeah, you're a good boy," the man said as Sarge and Trace returned to the living room, too. Sarge, cones surrounding his head, curled up on a rug near the fire. "Don't he look silly?" Ed muttered with a deep-throated chuckle. Tilly patted her husband's jean-clad knee. "We'd better get going. The storm's only getting worse." Ed struggled to his feet again and pulled a face as he cracked his neck and tried to keep up with his wife, who was walking briskly through the kitchen. "Ain't getting any younger," he admitted as they gathered their things, slid into jackets that had been hung on pegs near the back door, and wound hand-knit scarves around their necks. Once she was bundled up, Tilly said to Trace, "Now don't forget there's chicken in the refrigerator, along with mashed potatoes, green beans, and gravy." "That would be Tilly's killer chicken," Ed said, with a grin. He was rewarded for his compliment with a good-hearted swat from his wife. "I hate to brag, but he's right, you know." Tilly beamed a little. As an aside, she said, "It's the paprika. The colonel, he can have his 11 herbs and spices or whatever. Let me tell you, I've got paprika. No one remembers that old herbs and spices thing." Ed hitched his chin toward Trace and Casey. "These two, they're too young, way too young." He settled his hat on his head and walked to the porch, where his work boots were waiting. "Thanks for watching Eli and feeding the stock," Trace said. "Any time," Tilly answered with a smile, though, when her eyes met Casey's, the smile faltered a bit. As Ed yanked on his boots, she pulled a stocking cap over her gray hair, then shepherded Trace aside and whispered something to him while she eyed Casey skeptically. "Come on, Mother, let's go," Ed said, opening the door. A blast of cold air swept inside. "Oh, sweet Mary, we'd better get home. I heard on the news there's going to be a hell of a storm, and for once, it looks like they're right. You'd better draw some water in the bathtub and the sinks, just in case you lose power here. No reason to be out of water, too." They stepped outside, and the door closed behind them with a bang. Through the window, Casey saw the branches of the trees still dancing wildly. Snow was swirling crazily. Already drifts were piling against the side of the house and the outbuildings. Ed was right. It looked to be one hell of a storm, even by Montana standards. Once the older couple had climbed into their truck and rolled out of the driveway, the taillights of their old Dodge disappearing in the falling snow, Trace locked the back door. Casey was already removing Tilly's leftovers from the refrigerator. "Let me guess," she said, peering over the top of the refrigerator door. "Tilly pulled you aside to give you the word on me, right? I bet she thinks I look a little too much like your ex-wife." Trace lifted a shoulder. "And Jocelyn." "Huh." She kicked the door shut. "Now I'm a type." Placing the containers of food on the counter, she felt immediate contrition when she thought of Jocelyn Wallace and how she died. Realizing she was tired, hungry, and her nerves were strung tight as guy wires, she said, "Sorry, guess that's a little bit of a sore point. Tilly's impressed that you're a doctor." "Well, great." She cringed at how sharp she sounded. "I think I'm hungrier and grouchier than I thought." "Maybe it's the arsenic," he said soberly. "No, I'm fine. Even if they find it in the coffee grounds, I haven't had much coffee at home lately." What about you? You drank some this morning." He shook his head. "Either it's not there or just not in what you served up today." "That's something to celebrate, then," she said fervently. "You're right." He grinned then, and it made her heart clutch a little. "Here, let me heat this up," he said, reaching for the leftovers. "Mind if I check on Eli?" "No, please, go." Though Trace had looked in on his son the second they'd arrived at the house, it had been half an hour or so ago. Bonzi, who had explored every corner of the downstairs and had checked out Sarge, seemed to want to follow her, but the command, "Stay!" from her, and the smell of chicken kept him in the kitchen with Trace. Sarge, too, had taken up a spot under the table and was watching anxiously, hoping Trace would drop a savory morsel. Casey hated to think what kind of growling, snarling dogfight might ensue if any chicken hit the floor. "Be good," she told her dog. Kicking her shoes off at the base of the stairs, she hurried up the 5 steps to the landing, then turned and climbed the rest of the flight to the 2nd story, where an old railing with heavy newel posts prevented anyone from falling down the staircase. Eli's room was tucked under the eaves on one side of the hall, along with a spare room, used, it seemed, for storage. The door to the 3rd bedroom hung ajar, and she pushed it open a little farther, the light from the hallway spilling onto unused furniture, plastic tubs, and stacked boxes. The bath was located at the end of the hall, the largest bedroom next to it. She looked inside, saw a neatly made massive bed, and a small dresser with a flat screen mounted over it. Trace's room, obviously. Across the hall, wedged between the bathroom and the room used for storage, a door was open slightly, and she deduced from the trail of toys leading through it that it was Eli's area of the house. Pushing the door open farther, allowing more light inside, she spied Trace's son tangled in the rumpled covers, face down in his pillow. He was breathing loudly, his arm with its cast flung to one side. She stepped closer, careful not to crush toys on the floor, but a floorboard creaked. Eli moaned softly, then rolled onto his back. Blinking, he looked up, and his little face twisted in confusion. "Mommy?" he asked in a sleep-shrouded voice. Casey's throat constricted. "No." She sat on the edge of his bed and touched the fingers sticking out of his cast. "No, honey, it's Casey, Dr. Lambert. You remember me?" He was still eyeing her, and even in the semi-darkness she saw the hope on his face fade. As the storm raged outside, her heart cracked for the boy, but she forced a smile and pushed the hair off his forehead. He glanced at the closet, which was dark, its door closed tight, then to the window, as if he were trying to get his bearings. "But it's okay," she said, when she recognized his disappointment. He swallowed hard and bit his lower lip to keep from shedding tears. Her own eyes burned. "So, how are you feeling?" "Okay." "You want anything? Other than your mother?" "Nah." He shook his head and flopped back onto the pillow. "Okay, then go back to sleep, and I'll check on you later, okay?" He was too tired to argue, it seemed. Closing his eyes, he burrowed deeper under the covers, and though his forehead was creased with confusion for a second or two, soon he was breathing deeply again, probably dreaming about having a mom nearby. As she observed Eli for a few seconds, Casey mentally swore that if she were ever to run into Leanna, she'd wring her neck. "Stop it. She could be dead for all you know." That could explain why Trace hasn't heard from her, why she seems to have completely deserted her son. Give the woman a break. Leanna could be the victim of an accident like the others. There's a chance her body just hasn't been discovered. A cold chill slithered through her body, but even so she was angry with a woman who could abandon her child. Satisfied that Eli was sleeping soundly, Casey walked back to the hallway and down the stairs, where the scents of Tilly's killer chicken were wafting from the lower level. Her stomach had the bad manners to growl loudly as she entered the kitchen. Trace, gingerly lifting a bowl from the microwave, looked over his shoulder. "How was he?" "Confused. Thought I was Leanna." Casey admitted. "Kind of like Tilly," she managed to smile as she found plates and set them on the table. "I'm giving your son a pass. He's on medication and just a kid. Tilly, I'm not so sure." "She'll come around," he said. He served the dinner, and Casey, seated on a beat-up kitchen chair that looked to be at least 50 years old, had to admit Tilly's killer chicken was the best meal she'd eaten since Thanksgiving with Maribel. Maybe better. They ate in silence. The chicken was succulent, and the beans were seasoned with soy sauce and garlic. Even the mashed potatoes, tasting slightly of butter and sour cream, melted in her mouth, and really didn't need the gravy that she'd ladled on anyway. "Okay," Casey admitted, once her plate was nearly empty. "So she can cook, and knit. And didn't you say play checkers? And a lot more. Give her a chance. If she gives me one." "No promises there," he teased. "I'm going out and double-checking the stock. Make sure all the hatches are battened down. Want to come?" She glanced out the window, just as a gust of bitter wind rattled the shutters. "You know, I think I'll pass," she said. "Stay in with Eli and clean up the kitchen." "Can't get a better offer than that." She watched him put on his jacket again, long arms sliding through the sleeves. What was it about him she found so damned attractive? She who had always been interested in professional men, city guys. Like J.C.? Or maybe a guy who was more like one of Gerald Johnson's sons, not the men themselves, but a man in a suit and tie, with an uptight attitude. "Nope," she said aloud. With both dogs on his heels, Trace made his way outside to check on the cattle and horses for the night. Casey, meanwhile, cleaned the kitchen and settled onto the couch with her laptop. The TV, turned to an all-news channel, was still a decibel level loud enough to cause her permanent hearing loss, so she scrounged in the cushions of the couch until she found the spot where the remote control had fallen, then softened the volume. Currently, a weatherman was standing in front of a screen showing parts of Montana, Idaho, and Canada. With a sweeping movement of his arm, he explained how Arctic air was blasting down from Saskatchewan and Alberta to dump somewhere between 18 inches and 3 feet of snow in the next 48 hours. "Looks like we'll be getting that white Christmas a few weeks early," he said, happily, then cut to a reporter standing near the interstate, shivering and reporting on the freezing weather conditions as semis rolled down the highway behind her. A second later, the television screen changed, and the image of Ellie Alexander was visible. "The Pinewood County Sheriff's Office is asking for your help in locating the vehicle that may have pushed a local Dodge minivan off the road and into the Grizzly River," an anchor said, as the screen switched to that section of road, right before the North Fork Bridge, where in the snow flowers and candles had been left to mark the spot where Ellie Alexander had lost her life. Minutes later, the news was reporting on the death of a lone cross-country skier, whose name hadn't yet been released, pending notification of next of kin. She drew a breath, then hit the mute button, hearing the storm outside really start to rage, the wind shrieking, a branch beating against the house. A glance at the clock told her Trace had been gone nearly half an hour. He should be back soon, she figured. After walking into the kitchen, she stared through the window and told herself to relax. Her gaze followed the path broken in the snow as it led to the outbuildings. There was another path as well, smaller, going around the side of the house, and almost obscured by the new snow. Odd. But then Tilly and Ed had been here with Eli and Sarge. Perhaps one of them had taken Sarge outside. Tilly, probably, since the path was thin and she couldn't imagine Ed's size 12s tamping down the snow like that. Except, of course, the new-fallen snow changed the footprints, softened them, and made them appear smaller. Huh. She told herself not to worry, not to let the recent accidents, her own house being compromised, or her supposed poisoning get the better of her. She was safe, here, with Trace. And yet the feeling that something wasn't right here hung with her. "Just a new place," she whispered. wishing one of the dogs had stayed in the house with Eli and her. With one last look at the fast-disappearing path, she returned to the living room, where the crackling fire dispelled some of her unease. Curling up on the couch again, she opened up her laptop and did a little more research on Gerald Johnson, his company, and his family. Your family. Never, she said aloud, as the lights flickered once and a branch began beating against the side of the house like it was trying to get inside. Again she glanced at the back door, wishing Trace would return. Other noises assailed her, timbers creaking, the common sounds of an old house settling, the squeak and soughing of tree limbs rubbing against each other. Telling herself she was letting her nerves get the better of her, she fought a ridiculous panic attack and turned her attention away from the dark night beyond. She Googled everyone in the Johnson family and remembered her own impressions of Gerald and his children. Her father was an enigma, strong, smart, educated, hard-edged, a man who solved problems and faced adversity. Ruthless? Probably. As for his firstborn, Clarissa, she was a little more transparent, or at least seemed so on first look. Bold and arrogant, abrasive and downright bitchy, she was married to the Thor-like Lance, 2 peas in a pod. Casey wondered if either one of them had an inkling about a sense of humor. And yet they had children. Casey had trouble imagining anyone less motherly than Clarissa Johnson Werner, but she'd only seen her agitated. She couldn't help but think there was something going on with Clarissa, her snarly exterior hiding some darker emotion. Then there was Judd, next in line. Quieter, but the kind of guy that made you think of the old still waters run deep adage. Who knew what he was thinking, or what he was capable of? He was a lawyer, as was Thane, but Judd was definitely the more uptight, by-the-book corporate type, and from what she had read about him, was divorced from a wife who had moved to Portland. No kids. Thane was a mystery, quiet, friendlier than the rest, slightly amused, the black sheep who hadn't quite run off. Almost a rogue, but not quite. The one person in the group who wouldn't settle for being under his father's thumb. At least, not completely. Never married. Of all her half-siblings, the one she might be able to talk to, the least standoffish. She made a note. As for the twins, she didn't know where she stood with them. Cameron, who had smoothed his hair on more than one occasion in the meeting, had been more openly antagonistic toward her. However, Colt hadn't exactly been warm and fuzzy either. The smiles he'd offered seemed cold, as if he were amused by a private joke at her expense. Or had she imagined that? Neither twin had ever been married, at least not to her knowledge, but she knew very little about them, other than that they were salesmen for their father's company, and that their jobs took them all over the country and into Canada. Was it possible they were the culprits? Perhaps working in tandem, one offering up alibis for the other, while their jobs provided the perfect cover as they flew all over the country. Could they both be so perverted and twisted? Unlikely, she said under her breath, but told herself to dig a little deeper, find a way to check their business trips, and how they could have coincided with other unexplained accidents to unfortunate women who may have been born with the aid of a fertility clinic in Helena, Montana. That's nuts, she told herself, and turned her attention to Robert Lindley, the oddball, the one half-sibling most like her. He was older than she, and again she'd found no record of his marriage. Granted, she hadn't had time to dig deeply into any of their lives, but a marriage should have been easily discovered, a matter of public record. Robert, too, had been antagonistic. She'd felt his distrust of her from the second he'd walked into the boardroom. Did he still feel as if he were an outcast, even though he was part of the family, at least as far as the company went? But the ones she'd met weren't all of Gerald Johnson's children. 2 of his 3 daughters had died from separate accidents, Aggie as a child, Kathleen when she was still in college. Casey wondered about them. Accident victims. Was there such a thing when it came to Gerald Johnson's female progeny? But Clarissa, she survived. Apparently her father's right-hand woman. How does that make any sense? It doesn't, she said aloud as the wind whipped around the corners of the house and the lights flickered again. Her skin crawled, and she had to fight the feeling that someone or something was outside, something malicious, something waiting and watching. The storm was a bitch, rattling the old window panes, whistling through the rafters of the barn, causing the cattle to low and move restlessly. The dogs, too, were edgy, whining at the noise. Bonzi, for appearing tough, was really a wimp, it seemed. "Hang in there," he told all the animals and to the rescue dog. "We'll be fine." But Bonzi's tail hung low as another blast of wind shook the building. Trace ignored him and began rewrapping some exposed pipes that were freezing. It would take some time, but he wanted to ensure that the cattle continued getting water and that the pipe wouldn't burst. The lights flickered once, then again. Great, he thought, as he hadn't yet even broken a path to the horses in the stable a few yards away. The last thing he needed was to lose electricity. Bonzi cowered, whining through his nose, but Trace kept on insulating the pipes as best he could. Hopefully, things would be better when he reached the stable. So they separated. How perfect. From his hiding spot, night goggles allowing him to view the snowy landscape, he watched the house, had seen the old people leave. His eyes followed O'Halloran as he trudged to the barn with both dogs in tow. Aside from the kid, Acacia was alone in the house, and he could deal with the boy. Things were finally falling together, after the scare earlier today and the feeling that he was being followed again. He'd seen the BMW that he'd thought he'd caught tailing him the other night. He told himself he was imagining things, letting his paranoia rule, but again, today, earlier, he could have sworn someone was following him. Pull yourself together. Do you see anyone out here? Hear them? Has there been any glimpse of a damn BMW for hours? No! You're just jittery because tonight's the night. It's all come down to this. Time for revenge now, isn't it? Soon. Oh, so soon. Acacia's life will be in your hands. Despite the cold and the wind rattling the icy branches of the surrounding trees, he felt his cock twitch at the mental image of her lying beneath him, quivering in fear, eyes trained on the knife that he would use to slit her perfect throat. No, that's not how it's going down. This is not sexual, and there can be no knife. It has to look like an accident, just as you did with all the others. Don't stop now. Stick to the plan. She's one of them, those progeny of Gerald Johnson, who are mentally insufficient, even deranged. They all are. Even Clarissa, probably. She, too, cannot be spared, even though she's an ally. Eventually, she will have to die. But now, concentrate. First, you have to incapacitate her. Then you have to take out O'Halloran. Get him back to the house and stage the scene. Make it look like murder-suicide, and then burn the house to the ground. By the time the volunteer fire department arrives, it will be much too late. Training his gaze on the windows and the light beyond the panes, he caught glimpses of her walking through the house. Each time he saw her, he felt his blood heat in anticipation, knew he wouldn't have to wait much longer. Now Acacia was in the kitchen and looking through the window, straight at him. His heart stopped for just an instant. Then he realized she couldn't see him through the shroud of snow, didn't understand that he was observing her closely while plotting the details of her death. He mentally chastised himself. Do not unravel. Do not fall victim to your own paranoia. You have a mission. Do not be distracted by lust or fear. God damn it, be strong. Sucking air in through his teeth, feeling the cold burn through his lungs, he forced his thoughts clear, to center. Then he saw her again, peering through the night, and a new power overtook him. It was as if he could talk to her through his mind. You asked for this, bitch. You wanted to find me. He felt a smile twist the corners of his lips as he eyed the farmhouse with its gabled roof. Most of the windows were darkened, especially those on the second floor. Shifting his rifle from one gloved hand to the other, he realized exactly how he would deal with her. Another gust of bone-rattling wind cut through him, and the lights in the house blinked nervously. Again she looked his way, her beautiful face drawn into an expression of worry. Oh, if she only knew. Get ready, Acacia, he thought grimly, heading through the snow toward the front of the house, where the porch was dark. I'm coming. Where the hell was Trace? Just how long did it take to check on horses and cattle that Ed had already fed? Come on, she said, and thought about putting on her coat and boots and plowing her way to the outbuildings. But she didn't want to leave Eli alone. What if he woke up again and called for his mother? Feeling like an idiot, she decided to call Trace on his cell, and using her own phone, punched out his number and waited. A phone rang inside the kitchen and she jumped, then realized the cell belonged to Trace. He'd left his damned phone on the counter. He's fine. He has to be. The lights shivered once more, and this time Casey was spurred into action. Remembering Ed's advice, she drew water in the tub of the bathroom downstairs, found buckets and a flashlight in the kitchen. The fire was already blazing, wood stacked near the hearth, as she returned to the living room. Clunk! A noise overhead, from the floor above. Eli? She called, her heart hammering. She started for the stairs, had taken 2 steps when the lights failed. Darkness fell in an instant, only the fire offering a flickering red-gold illumination that cast the room in shifting, uneasy shadows. She hadn't been aware of the furnace rumbling or the refrigerator humming. But now there was total silence, a frightening quietude broken only by the howl of the wind and that same damned branch beating against the house. Waiting, she hoped to hear a generator switch on, prayed the lights would flicker and hold, the furnace would churn to life. Nothing. Now what? She felt cold as death, as if the wind outside were blowing through the bones of this old house. Her skin crawled as she thought of all the things that could go wrong in the dark, without heat, without light, with a homicidal maniac on the loose. Stop, she told herself sternly. Fumbling her way to the kitchen, where she'd left the flashlight, she banged her knee once, bit back a curse, and automatically groped for the light switch before stopping herself. Then, finding the flashlight on the counter, she pushed the button, and a weak yellowish light signaled that the batteries inside were nearly gone. Eli. He would know where more batteries were. And besides, she needed to haul him and his blankets downstairs so they could stay close to the fire. Glancing outside to the darkness, where no exterior lights offered the slightest illumination, she said, "Come on, Trace." The lights had gone off in the barn and stable, too. Surely he'd return ASAP. In the meantime, following the weak, thin light from the flashlight, she mounted the stairs. Darkness seemed to sink into her from every corner of this old, unfamiliar house. She rounded the corner of the landing and heard another thud against the house. What the hell was that? Eli? Swallowing back her fear, she thundered up the remaining stairs, swung around the newel post in the hallway, and pushed open the door to Eli's room. The bed was empty. Sheets and blankets had slithered onto the floor. "Eli!" she cried, searching crazily, swinging the beam of her flashlight through the room. "Eli!" She threw open the closet door and found nothing but clothes, then ran through the bathroom and Trace's room, the flashlight growing weaker, but giving up no trace of the boy. "Eli! Oh, God! Oh, God! Where was he?" Now in a full-blown panic, Casey was sweating despite the cold, fear clawing at her throat. She looked through the third bedroom, around the draped furniture, under the hems, through the maze of boxes and pictures stacked around the bed and mattress, pushed up against the wall. "Eli!" she called, and then, thinking he might be as frightened as she was, said, "It's Casey, honey. Where are you?" Oh, sweet Jesus, she'd lost him. Chapter 34. Pescoli drove. She didn't care that Missoula was out of their jurisdiction. She didn't give a rat's ass that the FBI was stepping in. She wanted answers, and she wanted them now. So while Alvarez was on the phone with one of their junior detectives, who'd been left in charge of turning Gerald Johnson's life inside out, Pescoli squinted through the windshield, where the wipers were having trouble keeping up with the relentless snow falling from the night sky. It was times like these she craved a cigarette, and if Alvarez weren't such a health nut, Pescoli, who'd learned her glove-box stash of Marlboro Lights was totally depleted, might break down and stop at a local convenience store for a pack of smokes and a super-sized cup of Diet Coke. That's the combo she needed, to keep her fired up. Gerald Johnson lived in a gated community, part of a resort that flanked a private golf club, where the buy-in was more than her house was worth, and the dues would eat up more than a chunk of her salary. She only hoped the bastard was home. Armed with Casey Lambert's theories and Alvarez's sketchy proof, she and her partner were going to see the old man, shake him up. Though she'd come to the party late, disbelieving Alvarez's suspicions that the victims could be related by blood, Pescoli was now on board. She'd finally bought into the wild idea that women were being killed because they were 727 sperm bank daughters. Why was another matter. Who, the most critical piece of all. The weather was a bitch, but then this was Montana in the winter. What did she expect? "Okay, got it," Alvarez said into her cell, as the radio crackled with news of a robbery and fleeing suspect on Main Street. "Keep looking. Anything you can find on Johnson, his kids in the clinic, call me back." She clicked off and glanced at Pescoli, her face tense as oncoming headlights flooded the interior with glaring light for a few seconds. "Leona's on it." Leona Randolph was a junior detective who had recently joined the department. Highly skilled in all things technical, Leona had the command of the Internet that amazed Pescoli. Though the girl was only a few years older than Jeremy, Leona was light years ahead of him in maturity, ambition, and direction. Her son could take a lesson. "I think the turnoff is about a mile ahead," Alvarez said, as the snow blew down in sheets, making visibility almost an impossibility. Pescoli slowed out of necessity. The traffic had been reduced to a crawl. Now, when she felt time was of the essence, that the killer was escalating, that the clock was ticking, she was stymied by the blizzard. "There's the private road to Cougar Springs," Alvarez said, pointing, just as the beams of Pescoli's headlights washed up against a wide turn. They plowed through the snow, and up a road that wound through the sparse timber of a mountain resort, and past a gatehouse where Pescoli flashed a badge at the guard and mentioned Gerald Johnson's name. Once the gate swung open, she put the Jeep into a lower gear and drove it up the steep, winding lane. A quarter of a mile in, they passed a 3-storied glass and cedar lodge, warm lights glowing from windows that climbed to the sharply pitched, snow-covered roof. Tonight, only a few cars, unidentifiable as they were half buried in the snow, were parked in the lot. Still upward they drove past forested lots with huge rambling houses tucked into the hillside. Many of them, the summer homes, were dark. Only a few showed warm patches of light blazing from windows, those owned by people who lived here year-round, or spent their holidays on the nearby ski trails. "Rough life," Pescoli muttered. "Boring life," Alvarez added. "I might be tempted to take a year or two of boredom, like this." "Oh, sure. You'd be climbing the walls inside a week. Back on the force within 2. She slid a look at her partner. "Who are you trying to kid, me or yourself?" "Both of us, maybe," she muttered. "What's eating you?" "My kids. What else?" She would have liked to blame her pent-up anger on the case, and that was part of it, of course. But with Jeremy, who seemed hell-bent on being a big fat 0, and Bianca, whose grades were slipping and was turning increasingly boy-crazy, was the real source of her angst. And it didn't help that she was getting pressure from Santana. "Turn here," Alvarez ordered. Pescoli cranked on the wheel, slid just slightly, then her tires caught and the Jeep whined up a final bend where the road emptied into a circular drive belonging to Gerald Johnson. "Showtime," Pescoli said, as she parked in front of a garage large enough to house a fleet of vehicles. Gaslights flickered near each of the carriage-style doors, mounted on the stone facade. Snow blanketed the walkways, but Pescoli followed Alvarez to the front door. As Alvarez poked a gloved finger at the bell, the door suddenly opened and Gerald Johnson, appearing more forceful and athletic than he had in any of the pictures Pescoli had seen, greeted them. "Officers," he said. "Floyd at the gatehouse called and said you were on your way." He stepped back from the door. "Come in. Ever since Acacia left my office this afternoon, I've been expecting you." Pescoli and Alvarez were allowed into the Johnson home, and just as they were asking Johnson about the clinic where he'd been a sperm donor, Gerald's wife appeared on the upper landing and then quickly descended the wide staircase. "Don't, Gerald. I don't know what these people want, but don't tell them anything." "We're here because of several recent homicides of women," Alvarez said. "Their deaths, which we originally thought were accidents, have been on the news." She pulled a plastic envelope with the pictures from her pocket. "Ellie Alexander, whose van was forced off the road. Jocelyn Wallace, who, we believe, was pushed over the side of Boxer Bluff. Possibly Shelley Bonaventure." "The actress in that god-awful vampire series?" Noreen Johnson asked, disbelieving. Pescoli nodded. "And now, most recently, a local woman named Carolee Rearson." "Carolee?" Noreen squeaked, a hand flying to her lips. "You know her?" Alvarez asked. "I know of her." Alvarez handed Noreen the pictures, and she took one look at the photo of Carolee Rearson and almost retched. "Oh, God! She was the nurse at the clinic where Gerald—" She turned to him, examining his grim expression. "We believe they're homicides, made to look like accidents," Alvarez said. "Homicides?" she repeated. "Murder? But what do we have to do with any of this? I don't know the others. Just Carolee." Pescoli said, "We have reason to believe they may have all been fathered by Mr. Johnson." "What? Fathered them?" Noreen flapped a hand at them. "That's insane. Gerald, do not talk to these people." Alvarez watched the woman's features where a gauntlet of emotions, everything from despair to denial to rage, played across her face. Dressed in designer jeans and a silvery knit sweater that covered her hips, she was rail thin, nearly bony, the expensive diamonds at her throat, wrist, and fingers, accentuating the bones and sinews that were visible beneath her tanned skin. Her near-white hair was cut boyishly, the skin of her face stretched taut as a drum, her makeup excessive. "We don't know these women. Barely even spoke to that Kara girl. Gerald, seriously." She shook her head vehemently and said to the detectives, "We're not talking to you without an attorney present. I know my rights." She slid a slim phone from the pocket of her jeans and punched a single number. "I'm calling Judd." To Gerald she lifted a pointer finger and admonished, "Not another word." He spread his hands. "They're not accusing me of a crime. "I don't care. They're tricky. I've seen Law and Order." She had the phone to her ear. "Oh, damn!" Meeting her husband's gaze, she said, "Judd's not picking up." Then, looking at the ceiling, she left a message. "Judd, it's Mother. Call me ASAP. It's an emergency." "For the love of St. Peter, Noreen, he'll think I'm in the hospital," Gerald protested. "Fine." She hit another speed dial number, waited, then rolled her eyes in frustration. "I can't get Clarissa either. Where the hell is she?" "Noreen, you need to calm down," Gerald said. "And you need to not tell me what to do." Gerald suggested to Alvarez and Pescoli, "Let's go into the den." He motioned them toward double doors to the right of the staircase, where a gas fire hissed, flames reflecting on the windows and the black sheen of a baby grand piano. A huge framed flat screen over the mantel was tuned to a sports network, a half-drunk glass of scotch on a table near a leather recliner. Cut flowers on a coffee table were starting to die, their blooms fading slightly, their scents nearly gone. "It's Mother! Call me! Emergency!" Noreen yelled into the phone again. As if by raising her voice, whomever she had phoned would pick up. The high heels of her boots clicked angrily as she marched stiffly into the den. "I can't rouse anyone. Where the hell are they?" "Honey, it would be best if you just chill out a little," her husband suggested. He waved the detectives into side chairs as he settled into the recliner and clicked off the television. The latest sports scores disappeared, and the screen briefly went black to be replaced automatically by a family portrait. "I will not chill out." She rotated the slim phone in one hand, while she glared at her husband. "Why does it seem like my children are avoiding me? Screening their damned calls." Her scorching gaze landed full force on Alvarez. "Why are you here?" "Noreen, please." Her husband held out his hand, fingers splayed, beseeching her to shut up. "Let me handle this." To Alvarez and Pescoli he said, "I told you I was expecting you because Acacia Lambert came to my office today. She had the same information you just told me about." "Who came to the office?" Noreen cut in, pacing back and forth in front of the fire. "Acacia who?" She was shaking her head, obviously not understanding. "What are you talking about, Gerald?" But there was something more than curiosity in her imperious gaze. There was a hint of trepidation, of fear. "My daughter," he said softly. His wife's expression froze. "What the hell are you talking about?" She whispered the question, her gaze darting to the officers for the briefest of seconds. "Clarissa is our daughter." "Not ours, Noreen. Mine," he clarified, and Alvarez could almost see him sweat. "With Maribel," he admitted. "Maribel?" Noreen stopped short. "That nurse who used to work for you?" She was nearly shivering with rage. "Acacia's nearly 35 now," Gerald said softly. Something deep inside Noreen broke. Her shoulders slumped, and tears welled in her big eyes. "I knew you two were intimate. Of course I knew, but—" Noreen's voice quivered. "And I've stayed your wife through that other debacle, when you claimed him, hired him, paraded him out like some precious puppy, and I suffered through that excruciating embarrassment." Her nostrils flared, and her lips curled back over white-capped teeth. "I've even had your bastard's whore of a mother here in my house." She pointed a finger at the thick carpet covering the hardwood. "I've suffered through that humiliation as well." Jabbing her finger at the floor, she started to sob. "But this... another one?" Tears slid down the severe slope of her cheeks. "Don't do this. Don't you tell them. I can't believe, not after that pathetic Lindley woman and her boy. My son's name is Robert, and he's a man." "What's wrong with you? Why have you done this? And with whores? You swore to me, do you remember, swore on our children's lives that you'd broken it off with that wretched Collins woman." "I did." She shuddered and looked as if she might throw up. But you had a child with her. And she was married then, too. Probably pawned that kid off as her husband's. When Gerald didn't respond, she said, "What is it with you? You didn't father just one bastard child. That wasn't enough. Now there's another. Do our kids know?" She seemed to shrink from the inside out. "Oh, God, they were there at the office when she showed up, right?" When he didn't answer, she said more loudly, "Right?" "That's probably why they're not answering their phones," Gerald said. "I told them I was going to tell you tonight." He glanced down at his half-drunk glass of scotch. "I just hadn't worked up the nerve yet. Funny how easy it is to father an army of children, but you don't even have the spine to talk to your wife," Noreen said under her breath. "Just listen, okay?" he suggested, and let out a heavy sigh. Noreen crossed her arms under her small breasts and jutted out her jaw defiantly, but held her tongue as he explained what he knew of Acacia and how he'd stayed out of her life. But when asked, acknowledged being a sperm donor. "So you knew that he'd been involved with a fertility clinic?" Pescoli asked Noreen. "That was so long ago," she said. "But yes, I knew that Gerald—" She waved one bony hand. "That was different, clinical, nothing intimate. Not like having an affair and fathering children with whores." The tears began again. She found a tissue and dabbed at mascara-stained tears drizzling down her cheeks. "I don't understand. That really doesn't explain why you're here. Even if he did, well, sire these women for lack of a better word. How do you even know that?" "It's the one thing that connects the victims," Pescoli said. "Victims?" Noreen was torn between horror and disbelief. "Oh, God! Why these women? Why now? And what does it have to do with him?" Alvarez said, "That's what we're here to find out." "Calm down," Casey told herself. "Eli has to be here. He has to." "Eli!" she yelled more loudly. "Eli, honey, where are you?" Frantic, her heart racing with fear, Casey searched the house top to bottom once more. Her flashlight was losing power, its beam weak as she moved slowly, room by room, calling out Trace's son's name. Her pulse was pounding erratically in her ears, dread propelling her as she swept the pale light under beds, into closets even. Dear God, down the laundry chute to the basement. Still no sign of him. "Come on, Eli, where are you?" The house was getting colder by the second. Through the upstairs she went another time, and there, in the third bedroom, she saw a crack, heard the whistle of air seeping through a window that wasn't quite latched. She tried to slam it shut, but it wouldn't catch. Throwing her weight into it, she heard, "What?" The skin on her scalp crinkled as she caught her breath and listened. Another noise. From the floor below. Footsteps? "Eli?" She slammed her knee against the old cedar chest as she raced to the hallway, then flew frantically down the stairs. The flashlight's faint beam bobbed and wobbled, casting shadows. Around the corner and into the living area she ran, where the fire crackled and hissed and the corners were cloaked in darkness. "Eli!" she said, her voice sounding loud, even echoing as the wind battered the house. "Honey?" But she saw no one on the main floor. Not Eli, not Trace, not the dogs. But she felt a presence, something different, like the scent of fresh night air clinging to the darkness. "Don't do this. Don't freak yourself out." In a flash, the night she was attacked in the parking garage sizzled through her mind. Brutal images of pain and fear. Pull yourself together. Keep searching. Where the hell is Trace's son? Bracing herself, nearly wincing as she passed gloomy corners, she pushed herself through the kitchen and into the stairwell. The steps to the cellar squeaked, and her nostrils filled with the dry smell of dust that had collected from years of neglect. Whispery fingers tickled her cheek. "Oh!" She nearly stumbled down the remaining steps as the cobweb brushed against her face and clung to her hair. Quieting her racing heart, she scraped the barest of light from her flashlight over stacked firewood. The scent of raw cedar faint in the cold space where more old furniture and tools had been left to gather dust. The flashlight was fading, but she forced its thin stream of light under the stairs, and across shelves where old canning glassware and boxes of insecticides hid. Scratch! She nearly dropped the flashlight as a mouse, its eye catching the fading light, scurried quickly into a crack in the concrete wall. "Oh, God! Damn! Eli!" she called again. But she heard nothing, other than the pounding of her heart, and somewhere far off, the sound of chains rattling in the wind, and that nerve-stretching thunk, thunk, thunk of a branch pummeling the house. She hated dark spaces, had all of her life. No, that wasn't true. Her real fear of the dark had come after the attack, when her assailant had sprung from the shadows. Again a horrid memory flashed through her mind, and in that instant her knees nearly buckled. She grabbed hold of a post, bolstering the stairs, for support, and in so doing dropped her flashlight. It rolled away, the light drunkenly spinning across forgotten chairs, exposed beams overhead, and a wall of ancient, dirty cement. Don't think about him. Push the attack out of your mind. It's over. But now that the image was planted, she couldn't forget her assailant. How his hard, angry body had been as it pressed her to the concrete. How it smelled of some faint aftershave, mingled with sweat and a trace of cigarette smoke. He'd been so big and strong, built like the men she'd met today, her brothers. Some of them had that same strong athletic build. Hadn't she thought of Judd as a football player? And even Lance, Clarissa's husband, had that same primal, nearly jungle cat-like quality. The others? What about Robert, or Thane, or the twins? And they all had those cold blue eyes. Heart pounding, breathing in shallow gasps, feeling the taste of fear in the back of her throat, she slid down the post, then crawled to the flashlight, scooped it up, and after giving herself a quick mental shake, struggled to her feet. You have to find Eli. Shaken, she pulled herself together. Up the stairs she climbed. Maybe he'd gotten out of bed and followed Trace to the barns. Perhaps he'd been disoriented. Hadn't he called her Mommy? There was a chance the medication had caused him to sneak downstairs and outside. How? Wouldn't you have seen him? Heard him? This was ridiculous. She needed help. She threw on her coat, gloves, and boots, took the time to light the one candle she'd seen in the living room with an ember from the fire. Then, with her phone clutched in her hand, she walked to the door and punched out Detective Alvarez's number. What would she say? She'd lost the kid? Trace hadn't come back from the barns? That was foolish. She didn't care. Better safe than sorry, she said, looking through the windows, feeling the seconds ticking by as the snow continued to pile and drift. When the detective didn't answer, Casey hung up, didn't leave a message. Not yet. She'd find Trace first, she thought, pocketing her phone and opening the door to the cold, dark night. As she stepped outside, a wall of cold air hit her so hard it seemed to strip any warmth from her body. Her skin chilled immediately, and she'd wished she'd taken the time to grab a scarf and hat. Over the keen of the wind, she thought again she heard chains rattling, like those on an empty flagpole, or the clinking sound of shackled prisoners walking. All in your imagination. Keep moving. Swallowing back her fear, she followed the trail of footprints she'd seen earlier that were nearly covered now, but she kept after them, not toward the barns, but around the corner of the house, past a snow-covered rhododendron bush, to the side of Trace's home, where more footprints had clustered. It was impossible to confirm, of course, to make out anything definitive with the snow blowing over the area. Over the wind she heard the branch still battering the house. Looking up, forcing the dying flashlight beam skyward. She not only saw the pines slapping at the siding, she noticed one of those fire escape ladders hanging from the window of the extra bedroom. The ladder moved with the wind, its chains rattling like the bones of the dead. Her heart plummeted. She knew in a heartbeat that Eli, with his broken arm, had somehow slithered down this ladder and disappeared into the frigid, unforgiving night. Chapter 35. Noreen Johnson had sunk onto the piano bench. Her shoulders hunched together, but, Alvarez observed, hadn't yet given up the fight. "For the love of God, Gerald, why couldn't you keep your pants up? First Robert with that awful Lindley woman, and of course you had to hire him so that I could be reminded every single day of your betrayal, and now another one? How could you?" Her cheeks flamed red. "What's done is done," Gerald said wearily. "We can talk about this later. For now, I think the detectives have some questions they want answered." "It's over," she whispered. "Our life, the one we knew, is over." Gerald cleared his throat and kept his tense gaze toward Pescoli and Alvarez. "What can I do for you, detectives?" he asked, leaning forward, hands clasped between his knees. Alvarez took the lead, asking him a series of questions. Gerald Johnson swore he'd never met the victims, hadn't known they could be sired by him, hadn't even guessed it until Acacia had shown up earlier in the day. He had no idea if any of them had any enemies, but he was certain from his children's reaction earlier that they were as surprised as he. Pescoli was keeping to herself, observing, though more than once Alvarez caught her partner studying the screen that had appeared when the television clicked off. Maybe it was her way of calming her aggression, but just listening, not interacting, was certainly out of character for her. Alvarez took another quick look at the TV screen. Nothing out of the ordinary. The current photo was of a family portrait taken years before, with Gerald and Noreen, 25 or 30 years younger, their children spread around them in matching outfits, the boys in white shirts, navy vests, and khaki slacks, the three girls in red dresses. Someone had added their names to the digital picture. "We have nothing to tell you," Noreen insisted, and sent her husband a silent message. She tried once again to call one of her children, to no avail. "Where are they?" she whispered, and closed her eyes. "Don't they know that we need them?" Pescoli said, "You had 7 children." "I had 7 children," Noreen clarified, sniffing angrily. "Gerald obviously had a few more." "What happened to your daughters, Agatha and Kathleen?" Pescoli asked. "I'd rather not talk about it." Noreen's voice was a whisper. She closed her eyes, her entire face tensed as from pain. "Agatha was our late-in-life baby," Gerald said. "There were complications with the birth, and we knew early on that there were issues. She would be mentally challenged. But she was an angel," Noreen glared at Pescoli. "I don't see what this has to do with anything." "How did she die?" Pescoli asked. Noreen looked like she didn't want to respond, but then reluctantly said, "It was an accident. I'd run to the store. Hadn't been gone half an hour. Clarissa, she's the oldest, was supposed to be watching the younger ones." She sighed and looked up toward the window facing the front of the house, but Alvarez knew she wasn't seeing the snow falling outside. Her sight was turned inside herself, to a time she would clearly rather forget. "As I understand it, the boys were playing, like they did. They've always been active. Aggie, she was supposed to be asleep, taking her nap." Noreen blinked and shook her head, dispelling the image running through her brain. "Oh, God, I can't do this." Gerald took up the narrative. "We don't know exactly what happened, but, as Noreen said, the boys were roughhousing. They had a wooden sword and were running up and down the stairs. Aggie woke up, walked out of her room with her blanket, and one of the twins, Cam, Noreen supplied miserably, bumped into her. A muscle in Gerald's jaw worked. She got tangled in her blanket, and she fell down the stairs. It was an accident. Alvarez met Pescoli's gaze. It was an accident, like Shelley Bonaventure accidentally took an overdose, like Jocelyn Wallace accidentally fell to her death over a railing, like Ellie Alexander accidentally slid off the road into the river in her minivan, or like Carolee Rearson accidentally skied into a tree. Frightened out of her mind for Eli, Casey started for the barn. She'd taken 3 steps through the knee-high snow, around the side of the garage, nearly at the gate separating the backyard from the barnyard, when she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. Her heart squeezed. Eli? She turned. No, much too tall, she realized, as the dark figure of a man began to take shape. A man emerging from the back porch. Trace? Thank God! Relief washed over her as she started heading his way. Trace, she began to call, when the sound suddenly died in her throat. Fear congealed her blood. Just the way he moved warned her, caused the hairs on the back of her neck to stand on end. The falling snow blurred the image, but now that he was closer, she knew he wasn't Trace. Dressed in black from head to foot, odd-shaped goggles over a ski mask, a rifle in one gloved hand, he started to jog toward her. No. She took off at a sprint, running fast as she could through the thick powder, churning up snow, getting nowhere. She heard him behind her, coming ever faster. On level ground she might have had a chance, but she was breaking the trail and he was following, gaining. Oh, God! Frantic, she yanked her phone from her pocket, hit redial and started to yell over the cry of the wind. Trace! She screamed, but her voice was lost in the storm. Bitch! He snarled so close to her, and she plunged forward, bracing herself, knowing a bullet was soon to crack her spine. Faster, faster, faster! Adrenaline spurred her on. Trace! She screamed again. If only she had a weapon, a knife, a rock, anything. Blam! Pain exploded in the back of her head. Her knees buckled and she fell forward, arms flung out, stretched. Her phone spiraled into the air to plummet into a drift. Snow covered her face, and her eyes felt as if they were jarred from her head. I'm dying, she thought, her brain on fire. I've lost them all. Blackness pulled at her consciousness, and she expected the darkness to overcome her. Yet she felt his hands upon her, rough, circling her ankles, dragging her backward through the frozen snow and ice. She heard him breathing, swearing, ranting. Supercilious bitch, ruining everything. A doctor, yeah, right. Think you're so damned smart. She tried to fight, to struggle, but her brain wouldn't engage, and she felt him drag her up the steps of the house, her chin bouncing on each icy ledge. Bang, bang, bang. Her chin split. Cartilage in her nose crunched. Pain ripped up her face. Tears sprang to her eyes, and she moaned. A stinging, as if by 1,000 yellow jackets had attacked her, pierced her skin. Blood trailed across the porch, following her into the house. It was all she could do to stay conscious. Who was he, she wondered, but knew it didn't matter. The fact that she wasn't dead already meant that he had plans for her. Ugly, horrific plans. Think, Casey, think. Don't give up. Don't let the darkness overtake you. Hang on. He kept dragging her across the linoleum kitchen floor and into the den where the fire burned low, reddish embers glowing in the hearth. Then he rolled her onto her back. She felt the blood staining her face. I've waited years for this, he growled, and for the first time she realized she hadn't been shot. No way would she have survived a rifle blast to the head. But the butt of his rifle showed red stains and hairs where he'd slammed it into the back of her head. God damn it, I wish I would have killed you the last time. In the parking garage, she thought. This man dressed in black was the same man who had attacked her years before. Who the hell was he? But then I wouldn't be able to savor it now. The voice. Oh, God, he was one of the twins. Cameron? Colton? Did it matter? He looked down at her through his black ski mask, and she imagined he was smiling, feeling superior. Take my time. She blinked, trying to stay focused. You're one of them, you know, he said. The unknowings. Those Geralds spawned. Females who are compromised. What? The pain in her body was agonizing, but she was keeping lucid with an effort, her gaze surreptitiously searching for a weapon, anything she could use against him, though he was still holding her ankles in one big hand, his other clutching his rifle. He was still railing. Like Aggie with her mental challenges and Kathleen with her depression. Suicidal, they claimed. But it ran deeper, much, much deeper. A genetic flaw. The flaw of all of Gerald's female offspring. It might not be evident early, but eventually it comes out. That's crazy, she said with difficulty, knowing somehow she had to turn the tables on him. You're insane. He flinched, then shook it off. Don't, he warned, shaking his head. Don't. He drew in a shaky breath, and she realized he was unraveling. What little grip he had on his mind was fraying second by second. His fingers tightened roughly over her ankles. It doesn't matter what you think, Acacia, never has, because you're one of them, the ones that could ruin everything, the lunatic females. He was certifiable. He'd made up some crazy nightmare fantasy about the female progeny of his father. What about Clarissa? She asked through painful, swollen lips. In time. It has to be all according to the plan. Accidents. Arranged at the right time. She had to get away from this maniac. She had to save herself. And save Eli. The fire popped loudly. As if he realized he was rambling, he snapped his head quickly back and forth, and the eyes that had been staring at her through his mask glared fiercely. Enough of this. We're done here. It's over for you. Now. With all her strength, Casey suddenly twisted her entire body. His fingers slipped around her ankles. Shit! She was free. Zeroing in on his crotch, she kicked upward, hard as she could. Her boot connected with soft tissue. Ooh! She nailed him directly in the groin, and he doubled over. Shit! He dragged in his breath so that it whistled through his teeth. You fucking bitch! Quickly, while he was disabled, she scrambled backward, trying to get to her feet, bumping a shoulder into the edge of the couch, her mind still thick from the blow to her head. Where the hell was Trace? She thought, wildly, as she forced herself upright and sprang through the archway to the kitchen. She had to get away, find Trace, locate Eli. Oh, dear God, had this monster already killed them both? Her attacker was sputtering, muttering crazy invectives, moving. She heard his footsteps as he gathered himself. Son of a fucking bitch, I'll make you pay. Trace's phone was on the kitchen counter, somewhere in the dark. If she could just get there, snag it and run out into the night, she might have a chance. She could call 911, or Alvarez, or... Her head still thundered, her mind was still thick. Her face ached, but she lunged forward. Click. The distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked echoed through her brain. You're not going anywhere, he said, his voice rough. Not after all the years of waiting. The phone was less than 3 feet away. She felt the cold barrel of the rifle pressing against her back. Move and I'll pull the trigger, he promised. She froze. heard the moan of the storm outside, wondered what her chances were. There were knives here, sharp, deadly blades. If she could just find them in the dark. A wound here. The nose of the weapon swirled against her spine, in the small of her back, just over her buttocks. Will take a while to bleed out, and you'll feel it, the life oozing from you. She squeezed her eyes shut. But there wasn't a roaring blast that echoed through the house. No searing pain cutting through her flesh. Why didn't he pull the damn trigger? Because he wants to make it look like an accident, just like the others. A gunshot wound to the back can only mean homicide. So think, Casey. You're in the kitchen. The knives are in the block at the stove. Don't even think about it, he whispered, as if he could read her mind. If I have to, I'll blow your sweet ass to hell and back. Then why don't you just... BAM! Pain exploded through her brain, and she crumpled to the floor. Chapter 36. Trace held fast to his pitchfork. His heart was hammering, his muscles tight as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. The smell of dung and urine filled his nostrils. The lights had gone out while he'd still been in the barn, still wrapping the damned pipe. He'd finished the job, though it had taken longer than anticipated, then headed to the stable. He'd noticed the house was dark, getting colder by the minute, and he felt the urge to hurry, to get back to Casey and Eli. He'd hoped she would have drawn the water and brought the boy downstairs, near the fire for warmth. Then he'd stepped into the stable and felt something was wrong. More than the damned electricity being out, or the worry of frozen pipes. No, this was a danger within. The horses were restless, almost spooked, shifting in their stalls. He heard the sounds of rustling straw, nervous snorts, and every so often an anxious whinny. Sarge, too, was out of sorts, stiff. He growled once and stared at the windowless rooms where the oats and other grains were stored. Bonzi, not knowing the drill, hadn't been all that concerned, but his ears were up, at attention, aware of an unseen being hidden in the darkness. The back of Trace's throat went dry. An animal? Or human? His skin prickled under the collar of his jacket, and he knew the answer. An animal would elicit a different response from his dog. This threat was definitely a person skulking in the shadows. He thought of shouting out. Maybe it was just someone who'd come in for shelter from the storm. But why not stop at the house? Someone on the run? Someone scared? Or someone intent on doing harm? His heart grew stone cold. He thought of his rifle hidden deep in his closet, the ammunition locked away in an overhead cabinet in the kitchen. Then his mind went to Casey, alone in the house, with his son. Sarge growled again, and Trace heard a noise. The tiniest squeak of the stable's floorboards. Every muscle in his body tensed. Blood pounding in his ears. He held his pitchfork like a spear and began moving slowly through the darkness. "You can't die, damn it," a female voice whispered harshly. "Who's going to take care of Eli? Who?" Oh, Lord. Now she was imagining things. Hearing the voices of angels, Casey thought. Pain surging through her body. She fought back the urge to vomit, and when she opened a bleary eye, she saw only darkness. Lying on the kitchen floor, the room spinning, she tried to pull herself to her knees. Agony ripped through her skull. "Get up! Pull yourself together!" The house was still, aside from the wind outside. Her attacker had fled, but he would be back. She knew it, just as she knew Eli and Trace were in danger. If they were alive. She listened for the voice in her head again, heard nothing, and tried like hell to get to her feet. At the Johnson estate, Alvarez glanced out to the frigid night. Where was he? Where was the killer who had wreaked so much damage? What was he doing? And Kathleen? Pescoli pressed, bringing up the other Johnson daughter who had died. She was killed in a skiing accident, Gerald said, scowling, as if his own words tasted bitter. Skiing accident? Alvarez repeated. Any of her brothers present the day she died? What? Noreen blinked and fiddled nervously with her collar. What are you suggesting, detective? Pescoli's smile held zero warmth. Let me guess. Was it Cameron? No, Noreen said, her face shattering as tears came again. I mean, yes, he was there, but so was most of the family. Convenient. Pescoli was irritated as she glowered at this couple whose entire married life had been shrouded in secrets. Cameron, one of the twins? He was the one Pescoli was zeroing in on? Alvarez thought of the two men who looked so much alike, whose jobs took them throughout the country, handsome and smart, but deadly? To his mother she asked, Do you know exactly what happened the day Kathleen died? Noreen glanced at her husband, and then worried her lip. Of course, Cameron was skiing with Kathleen on that last run, but that doesn't mean there were hundreds, probably thousands of people on the mountain that day. She sounded as if she were trying desperately to convince herself. Alvarez was trying to remember everything about Cameron Johnson. He worked for the family business, lived on the outskirts of Grizzly Falls, on the way to Missoula. Poor Kathleen, sighing, tears filling her eyes, Noreen added. She'd finally found a man who loved her, despite... Despite what? Pescoli asked. Nothing, Noreen shook her head quickly. Nothing at all. She beseeched her husband silently, but he threw up a hand, his own face a mask of sadness. Kathleen battled bipolar disorder, Gerald admitted sadly, one of his hands actually trembling. I was a doctor, wouldn't believe it. At the time we really didn't know what to call it. We said she had spells, or she was manic or depressed. I couldn't really accept that she was suffering so. Seriously? Alvarez wondered. The second child who died from an accident had mental issues? Was there a connection? Seemed unlikely. Then again, everything about this case was slightly askew. Gerald, don't you see? Noreen interjected. They're saying anything they can, grasping at straws. Glaring at Pescoli, her nostrils flaring, she added, They're insinuating that Cameron killed Kathleen. Can you believe it? Cam! She was shivering in rage. And that's not the end of it. They're also trying to pin those other accidents where the women died on him, as if he were able to... This is unbelievable. Noreen started pacing again, growing hysterical. But it's not true. It just can't be. Spinning on a heel, she pointed at Pescoli. Get out! Now! Get the hell out of my house! You're despicable, both of you! She was crying in earnest now, her eyes trained on the large window facing the drive. This isn't over. We're not done, Pescoli said, rising to her feet. Alvarez took her cue, checking her cell phone and starting for the door, just as headlights pierced the paned windows, washed against the walls. Over the whistle of the storm, the roar of a powerful engine surged through the night. Noreen's shimmering eyes widened. The faintest of sad smiles tugged at the corners of her lips. Oh, thank God, she said, dropping a relieved hand over her heart. Judd's here. Judd? The oldest son? Why? As Gerald got to his feet and tried to stop his wife, Noreen raced into the hallway, her heels clicking on the marble floor as she flung open the door. A tall man, broad in the shoulders, his expression grim, entered. The family resemblance was unmistakable, Judd's bearing and facial features almost identical to his father's. He gave his mother a quick, almost obligatory hug, as he surveyed the group in the den. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice low, his eyes narrowing suspiciously as snow melted on the shoulders of his black overcoat. With his mother still clinging to his arm, he strode into the den. "It's the police," she said, as if he were the damned cavalry, sent to rescue her. "They've come here asking all kinds of questions about those women who died." Noreen was talking fast. "The newest accident victim is Carolee Rearson, from the clinic. Oh, no." She was shaking her head as she connected the dots. Oh, God. I tried to set her up on a date with your brother." Stricken by her thoughts, she looked as if she might buckle. Licking her lips, one hand at her throat, she whispered, "But it can't be." "Mother," Judd warned, "stop talking." To the police, "I'm an attorney. I don't want you to speak to my parents without counsel present, and it can't be me. I assume this is something criminal, or you wouldn't be here. I'll get in touch with Herman Carlton, a friend of mine, and I'm sure you've heard of him." Herman Carlton hailed from Spokane, but practiced in Montana as well. Of course they'd heard of him. In Alvarez's opinion, Carlton was a prick of a defense attorney, and a miserable human being. But he would be trouble in a court battle. Big trouble. "Hold on," Gerald said. "No one's accusing anyone of anything." Pescoli interrupted and said to Noreen, "The son that you set up with Carolee Rearson, which one is he?" "Mother, don't!" Judd was adamant, and Noreen snapped her mouth shut. "It was Cameron," Gerald said gently, his gaze on his wife's stricken face. And all the pieces of the puzzle started locking into place. When Judd tried to say something, Gerald held up his hand as if to stop the barrage of denials. In a softer voice, he said to the detectives, "I overheard my wife talking on the phone with Clarissa about a potential date." As Noreen bristled, her spine stiffening, he added, "It's over, honey. We can't bury our heads in the sand any longer." "You're a bastard, Gerald," she shot back. "You know that, don't you? A #1 bastard. And I never called him." Noreen shook her head. "Cam didn't know that I'd spoken to Carolee." "Of course he did, because Clarissa would have told him. They're tight," Gerald said. "And if she told him, I'm willing to bet the whole damned family knew." He stared at Judd. "You?" Judd's jaw slid to one side. He didn't answer. It was admission enough, at least in Alvarez's mind. "Come on, son," his father implored. "Judd?" Noreen pleaded. With a shrug, the attorney reluctantly said, "Okay, I'd heard." His lips twisted into a deep line of disdain. "Clarissa doesn't know how to keep a secret. Never has." Noreen, broken, let out a little gasp. Gerald's sigh was deep with despair. As the fire crackled and the snow continued to fall outside the window, where the gaslights glowed, he said to Judd, "You can't protect him any more." "Where is he?" Pescoli demanded. "I don't know," Gerald shook his head. "He keeps to himself." Pescoli ordered, "Call him." "I tried on the way over here," Judd admitted. "He's not answering." "Try him again." She wouldn't budge, but Alvarez knew they would get nowhere further. They'd learned more than they'd expected, and now they had to act, fast, to prevent Cameron Johnson from killing again. She said to Pescoli as she pulled out her phone, "We don't have time for this." "You're right." Her partner threw the Johnson family one last angry look, but she was already starting for the door. "Let's find the son of a bitch." Click. Trace heard the distinctive cock of a gun and froze. No one could see him in the dark. Whoever was inside the stable wouldn't be able to draw a bead on him. He had the advantage. He knew his way inside and out of this old building. Unless the prick has night vision goggles, or a scope. Damn it! Sarge growled again, low and throaty. Trace felt the dog tense. His own grip tightened on the pitchfork. He eased toward a post where, at least, he'd have some protection. "Show yourself, you sick son of a bitch." Then he saw it, the tiniest movement, a shadow in the deeper umbra of the stable. His eyes narrowed, his gaze searching, trying to make out the person. He drew the pitchfork back, ready to launch it through the air, then stopped. Eli. What if somehow his son was in the darkness, hiding? Or what if whoever it was had kidnapped his boy and was going to use him as a shield? His insides turned to water. Then he thought of Casey, and that made it worse. She could be inside, held with a gun pointed at her head, watching the horror unfold. Heart thudding, he tried like hell to make out whoever it was, but the Stygian darkness was impossible to pierce. "What are you waiting for?" The voice was deep and male. It taunted. "You think that stupid pitchfork can do any real damage?" And then laughter. Deep, cruel. So the bastard could see him. Trace's blood burned. "Who are you?" he demanded, his weapon still ready to be hurled. "Does it matter?" A snide, sickly question. "Eli?" he said. "No, I'm not Eli." "Oh, your kid." A pause. "What the fuck are you thinking?" So he didn't have the boy. Good. "Let Casey go." "Now that wouldn't make sense, would it? Not after I waited all this time." Trace crumbled inside. The madman had her, intended to kill her if he hadn't already. A new fury took hold, and he searched for something, anything so he could see. But there was nothing, not so much as a match. "She's waiting for you. So that's why I think it would be better if I kill you up at the house with her. Make it look like she did it. An accident, you know." She was still alive. "You crazy son of a bitch." But not crazy enough to fire a rifle in a closed space where it could ricochet. Maybe. Sarge growled again from somewhere nearby. "Tell that mutt to back off," the voice commanded, "or I'll blow his mangy hide to kingdom come." "Show yourself," Trace demanded. "Not on your life." "Then go to hell." He drew the pitchfork back. Stepping out from behind the post, he threw all his body weight behind his shoulder and let it fly. It hurled through the darkness as he jumped behind the thin post. "Oh!" A horrifying scream echoing through the building. "You fucker!" Crack! A blaze of light flashed in front of Trace's eyes. Thunder crashed through the stable, rolling through his brain in harsh, loud waves. Panicked horses screamed. The dogs barked and howled. A pain as hot as the fires of hell seared Trace's thigh. The impact of the bullet so powerful, he fell backward. Hard. His head hit the floorboards with a thud, and he momentarily lost consciousness. A soothing blackness luring him under, away from the horror and the chaos within. "Don't give in. You're a dead man if you let the blackness take you. Think of Eli, of Casey." Dust and the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder filled his nostrils as he blinked himself awake. The dogs were going nuts, barking and growling like crazy. Horses still kicked and squealed in fear, scrambling in their stalls, while the scent of fear hung heavy, mingling with the thin odor of burning gunpowder wafting from the direction of the killer. "You fucking son of a bitch," he growled. Trace heard him writhe and swear somewhere near the grain chutes. The dogs ran in circles, while Trace hoped beyond hope that his pitchfork had done serious, tissue-ripping damage. "You're gonna die, O'Halloran, and it's not gonna be easy," the killer snarled. "You hear me? You're a dead man, cocksucker. You and your bitch girlfriend." Casey staggered to her feet, swaying, struggling to think straight. Her mind was sludge, her face on fire, her head thundering in pain. She held the door jamb for support. Trace is out there somewhere, and so is Eli, and the psycho. Gasping, she dragged in deep breaths of air to clear her head. Crack! Outside, the sharp report of a rifle split the snowy night. What? Casey cut back a scream. Trace. Oh, God. Eli? In the darkness, she fumbled across the kitchen table for Trace's cell phone. Please, oh, please. Her fingers hit something that jangled and fell. His damned keys. But next to it, yes! She found his cell phone and dialed the last number in her brain. That of Detective Alvarez. The call went directly to voicemail. Damn it! She left a quick message. The bastard's here. We need help. Oh, God, please, send... She tried to tamp down her rising panic. Found the control she'd used with patience. Detective Alvarez, this is Casey Lambert. I'm at Trace O'Halloran's place, on Old Mill Road. He's here. The killer is here, somewhere. He's attacked me, and I just heard gunshots coming from one of the outbuildings. Both Trace and Eli are missing. Please, send help. Stat. I don't know the address, but it's only about a quarter of a mile west of Red Wing Corner. A mile from the county road. Please send officers. Heart clamoring, she dialed 911. She couldn't wait for Alvarez to respond. When dispatch picked up, she tersely explained the situation, and the operator insisted she not go forward. Keep on the line, the female voice ordered. I'm dispatching deputies right now. They're 10 minutes away. 10 minutes is too long, Casey spat. Tell them to hurry. She knew in her heart that there was no way they could make it in time. She clicked off, anxiously peering through the darkness of the house. She didn't dare go into the stable without a weapon, but she didn't want to take the time. What if Trace were wounded? She was pretty sure Trace hadn't fired the gun. No, it was probably the sick son of a bitch who had Eli, who had taunted her with his rifle barrel. Oh, God, was it possible that either one of them was hurt? Or worse? Don't go there. You don't have time for recriminations. Move. Save Trace. Save his son. In her search for Eli, she discovered Trace's rifle, hidden in a closet. Now, pain screaming through her brain, she hurried forward, then up the stairs in the dark, using Trace's cell phone's weak, bluish light as a guide. Fumbling, cursing, determined to save them, into Trace's room. She cracked her elbow on a dresser corner as she stumbled her way to the closet, where she pushed aside clothes and a suitcase. It was here. I know. There. Her fingers curled around the shotgun's barrel, and she yanked the old gun from the closet. The Winchester was dusty, unused, but she didn't care. Praying that the rifle was armed, she checked the chamber. Empty. Of course, he had a kid. Was careful. Frantic, the cell phone winking out every 10 seconds, she scoured the closet. There were no bullets nearby, no boxes of ammunition on the shelf, nor in the dresser where she rifled through T-shirts and underwear, socks and jeans. Come on, come on. The nightstand, too, was empty. No loaded handgun, no bullets for an ancient rifle. Precious seconds ticked by. Her heart was racing, her brain on fire. Where, oh God, where? She didn't dare bluff the killer. Knew better than to take an empty rifle to the stable. Fear spurred her. She hauled the rifle downstairs and through the living room, where the fire was dying. Where would he keep the ammo? Far from the gun, yes, but where it was safe and could be accessed by him, not so easily by his child. Close to the door? Because he would only use it outside? Quickly she went through several drawers in the kitchen, opening them, searching them with her fingers, slamming them shut. Then, seeing, as the cell phone's light faded again, the handle of another flashlight. Oh, please, she thought, feeling precious time slipping past. Even now, Trace could be bleeding, dying. She flipped on the flashlight, and a sure, strong beam lit up the room. Quickly she went to work, searching the remaining drawer, when she spied the tallest cupboard mounted above the refrigerator, the same place her grandfather had hidden his ammunition. Could it be? Hurrying, counting her heartbeats, she hauled herself onto the counter, then yanked the door open. Next to a nearly empty bottle of whiskey was a metal box, locked tight. No way she could pry it open. She needed a key. Oh, God, where? She raked her gaze around the room and spied Trace's keyring that she'd knocked over searching for his cell. Quickly she pulled the musty box from its hiding place, hopped to the floor, and scooped up the jangling keys. With shaking fingers she separated the keys and found one that was tinier than all the rest. Please, oh please. She shook the other keys away from it and threaded it in the lock. Click. Thank God. She popped open the box and found the mother lode, a box of shells. "Take that, you miserable son of a bitch," she said under her breath, as she thought of the killer. Mentally thanking her grandfather for her lessons years before, she loaded the rifle quickly, pocketed an extra pack of shells, and prayed to God she wouldn't have to use either, as she headed outside again and into the storm. "Shit!" Trace's attacker swore loudly, his voice reverberating through the stables. Who the hell was this lunatic? Not that it mattered. In that respect, the killer was correct. For the moment, Trace just had to figure out a way to stop the son of a bitch before he did any more damage. Moving slowly, dragging himself toward the wall, Trace tried to come up with a plan. Over the rage of the wind, he heard the distinctive sound of the would-be killer drawing in his breath through his teeth. "Shit!" the man growled again, then let out a yowl accompanied by the soft, whooshing suck of the pitchfork's tines being yanked from his body. "You fucking cocksucker!" Pain echoed in his voice. "You're gonna pay for this, you hear me, O'Halloran?" Trace didn't respond, just kept low, pulling himself with his hands as he slid silently along the floor, edging toward the wall. The horses were out of their minds with fear, hooves shuffling, shoes ringing against the stalls from slamming feet. Sarge, or was it Bonzi, too was upset, growling deep in his throat. A warning. "No, don't." "And the dog," the gunman said aloud. "He's dead too. Where are you, you mangy mutt?" Now there was satisfaction in his voice. "Ah, there you are, Cujo. Come on, boy." The assailant cajoled as the horses snorted and stomped. "See what I've got for you?" Fury singed through Trace's brain. If he could just get the drop on this son of a bitch, he'd kill him. He felt his blood flowing, reached down to feel it wet and sticky from his leg wound. But he'd be damned if he was going to lie here while this maniac killed his dog, then went after Casey or Eli. No doubt she was the true target. His son, like Sarge and Trace himself, were just extraneous obstacles that had to be cleared to the killer's main objective, Dr. Acacia Lambert. Trace scooted backward, felt blood flowing out of his leg, his head slightly dizzy from the adrenaline rush. He reached the wall. "Here, doggy, doggy." The killer's sing-song voice masked a groan of pain. The bastard was hurt worse than he'd admit. "Good. Suffer, you bastard. And while you're at it, die." Trace reached over his head and felt the handle of the shovel. With a wide, sharp blade, it was perfect for scooping manure or shoveling snow, and tonight, he hoped, as a weapon to kill a murdering psychopath. "Come on, boy." The son of a bitch made twisted little kissing sounds as he moved closer, still invisible in the darkness. Trace's fingers coiled over the smooth wooden handle. Bam! The door to the stables banged against the wall. Horses nickered in terror. Trace jumped as a rush of cold air swept into the room. "What the hell?" The gunman turned his attention away from the dog. "No!" Trace went into full-blown panic. "Casey, no!" She was the only one at the house, or Eli, and the killer knew it. "Get away!" Trace screamed. "Sister?" the attacker drawled smoothly, almost gleefully. "About time you showed up." Chapter 37. Damn it all to hell. Alvarez listened to her message from Casey Lambert and mentally kicked herself from here to hell and back. Furious, she punched in the emergency number and talked to dispatch, who said there had already been a distress call logged and deputies sent to an address for Trace O'Halloran, that gunshots had been reported. Hanging up, she dialed Casey's number, but was sent directly to voicemail. "Too late," Alvarez said grimly to Pescoli. "Looks like he's at the O'Halloran place." "What? No!" Noreen let out a cry that rose to the coffered ceiling. Alvarez, standing just inside the Johnsons' front door with Pescoli, threw a look over her shoulder. "I was afraid of this," Judd said. "You know he's never been right, Mother, even from the start, when he pushed Aggie down the stairs." Alvarez held up a hand, stopping her partner from yanking on the door handle. "It was an accident," Gerald said, sinking into his chair again, as Alvarez stepped back into the den with its cheery fire, fresh-cut flowers, and simmering lies. "It was," Judd insisted. "Of course it was an accident. But essentially that's what happened." "You told me," Gerald reminded his son, looking up to meet Judd's narrowed eyes, "that Aggie got tangled in her blanket." "I know, that's right," Judd said smoothly, almost as if he'd practiced the line. "And then Cam ran by and knocked her down. She got wrapped up in her damned blanket and fell." Noreen shuddered. "To her death." Gerald glared at his son. "We've got to go," Pescoli said tersely. Alvarez rejoined her as she opened the door, and the breath of winter blew through the room, rattling umbrellas in a nearby stand. To Gerald, his wife, and oldest son, Pescoli added, "You all stay put. Don't go anywhere." "It's not Cameron," Noreen wailed. But Judd Johnson's tense face said it all. His mother, appearing far frailer than she had just half an hour earlier, collapsed in his arms. Tears rolled from her eyes, and she sobbed against his expensive coat. Her voice muted as her shoulders shook. It's not Cameron. It can't be." Pescoli was already out the door. The last look Alvarez caught of Gerald was of the big man seated in his leather recliner near the fire, holding his head in one hand, reaching for his glass of scotch with the other. "I'll drive." Pescoli was already out the door, and Alvarez was only a couple of steps behind. As she climbed into the passenger seat, Pescoli engaged the engine and threw the rig into gear. The Jeep lurched forward. Alvarez pulled the door shut as they reached the end of the circular drive, and she'd barely gotten her seatbelt connected when they were heading onto the slippery road winding down the hillside. "What the hell happened?" Pescoli asked. "Something's going on at the O'Halloran place," Alvarez said, thinking of the man whom she was now certain was the killer. "Looks like Cameron Johnson is escalating, and he's starting with the people there." "And killing his sperm bank sisters? Or anyone who's in his path?" Alvarez repeated what she'd heard on voicemail. In the dark car, her face pale, Pescoli muttered, "The bastard's a raving lunatic." She drove as fast as she dared, past the lodge and gatehouse, then cast Alvarez a glance as they reached the main road. "Don't suppose you have a cigarette, do you?" Alvarez sent her partner a dream-on look, then punched in Casey Lambert's cell phone number again and waited. The call went directly to voicemail once more. Trace's fingers tightened on the shovel's handle. "I wondered if you'd show up," the killer said. And there in the doorway, silhouetted against the white drifts, Casey stood, feet wide, a gun in her hands. But she couldn't see into the darkness, couldn't guess where they could be. Click! The bastard cocked his gun. What was Casey thinking? "Get back!" Trace screamed. Frantic, he yanked the shovel from the nails that held it to the wall. Twisting the blade of the shovel in front of him, he started scrambling backward to the door to save her, push her away, use his body as a shield. Any damn thing to protect her. Too late! A brittle, hollow laugh echoed behind him. "Watch out!" Dragging his useless leg, sensing the streak of blood he was leaving on the floorboards, he forced himself to the doorway. "He's got a gun!" "So do I," she said calmly. Too calmly. "Stay down." Blam! Her gun's nose sprayed fire, her silhouette slipping away behind the exterior wall. Trace had flattened to the floor even before she pulled the trigger, the room spinning around him, his neck twisted as he stared at the doorway. Crack! Click! Crack! Click! Crack! The killer fired in rapid succession, sending the timbers of the stable shaking and the horses squealing and snorting, rearing in sheer terror. Steel-shot hooves pounded the walls of the stalls. The dogs, too, were barking madly. Over it all, he heard a single heart-stopping cry. "Casey!" He rolled over and tried to get to his feet, to stumble forward, but his leg wouldn't work. The best he could do was drag himself through the smoke and fear that rose to the rafters. Another horrifying moan, as if her soul was being ripped from her body. "No!" he screamed. "No!" A satisfied chuckle crackled from behind him, the killer's sick pleasure oozing through the aftermath. "You sick cocksucker, I'm going to get you," Trace thought. "Trace!" "What?" "Trace!" Casey's terrified voice reached him, a distant weak cry, diluted by the rush of the wind, as if she were truly exiting this world, and he was truly losing her. "But she's alive. There's still time." "Hang on!" he ordered brokenly. "Hang the hell on!" Using the shovel to drag himself forward, he pulled himself closer toward the doorway, to the frigid air blowing snow into the stable. Somewhere behind him, he heard the uneven footsteps of the killer, but he kept moving, didn't care that the rifle might be trained on the back of his head. Through the doorway he crawled into the night, the cold a welcome slap to his swirling senses. He saw her then, unmoving, a crumpled form lying in the snow just outside the building, strands of her hair being lifted by the wind. "No, no, no! Oh, dear God, let her still be alive." "Casey!" he choked out. "God, please, Casey!" Again he heard a noise behind him, the wounded footsteps of the assassin. Was the bastard going to kill him now? He thought he saw her move. Oh, sweet Jesus! Yes, there it was again. One foot was twitching. He crawled closer to where he could see the rest of her body and noticed a terrifying, spreading darkness staining the snow beneath her. "Why?" he whispered, fury tearing through him. Why had she come to his rescue? "Too late, lover boy," the big man behind him was saying, breathing hard. Far in the distance, too far, sirens shrieked over the howl of the wind. Exhausted, breathing hard, Trace looked over his shoulder and saw a huge, shadowy shape fill the doorway. The rifle was at his shoulder, night goggles covering his eyes, but he leaned a shoulder against the door jamb. Trace saw dark splotches begin to color the snow beneath the man's left arm, so the pitchfork had done some damage. "You're dead now, you son of a bitch," the killer warned, his voice a watery hiss. That's when Trace noticed the gun in the snow. Lying at the end of Casey's fingers, its barrel pointed away from her. Still holding the shovel as protection, Trace lunged, one arm outstretched. He missed, his fingers brushing the gun's muzzle and causing it to spin, burying deep in the snow. The killer laughed, a gurgling demonic sound that echoed through the night. "Nice try, bastard!" Click! Trace sprang. Swinging his shovel, the blade knifing through the air, he landed in a drift a foot from the gun. Snatching up the weapon, he nearly passed out in the process. All he could think about was Casey, sweet Casey, how she tried to save him and died in the process. "Say your prayers, cowboy," the killer ordered, hobbling closer, his rifle aimed straight at Trace. "You're gonna get to join your girlfriend." A tremendous growl erupted from inside the stable. The killer glanced back, momentarily distracted. Both dogs catapulted through the open doorway. Snarling, ears flattened, heads low, fangs showing, they split, one turning left, the other right. They determinedly circled the killer, and snapped and lunged, like hungry wolves ready to bring down prey. "Shit!" The killer didn't hesitate, just took aim at the bigger dog. "Bonzi!" "No!" Trace yelled, trying to stagger to his feet and falling backward. Bonzi leapt, exposing his big chest and belly, white teeth flashing against his dark lips. Blam! The killer jerked, squealed. His rifle spun out of his hands. Blam! Again the assassin's torso bucked, his arms flying wildly. He dropped, falling onto his knees. Blood bloomed over the front of his jacket. His head lolled, and he stared at the growing stain as if he couldn't believe it. "Where is he?" a woman demanded, her voice stern in the night. Trace, dizzier still, looked over his shoulder. "What? Who was—" She drew closer, a rifle to her shoulder. The sight of her gun, his rifle, centered on the wounded man. "Casey?" But he looked down at the woman he loved, Casey, lying pale as the snow that was beginning to cover her, as the siren shrilled more loudly. "Where the hell is Eli, Cameron?" This new Casey demanded, holding her rifle on the flailing, injured man. Trace thought he might be hallucinating. Two of them. The newcomer, Casey, was still advancing. But it can't be. She reached the wounded man and kicked his weapon away from him. The would-be assassin let out a last, gasping groan that rattled, wet in his lungs, then didn't move. Pulling her gaze from his masked face, she turned, finding Trace's eyes before she saw the blood flowing from his thigh, the snow around him discolored and dark from his blood. "Oh, Jesus, Trace!" Woozy now, the blackness pulling him under, he watched, sliding onto the ground, as she ran to him as if in slow motion, kicking up snow, the rifle in one hand, a flashlight bobbing in her pocket. She crossed the short, powdery distance, and fell to her knees at his side. "Oh, God, you're hurt." "Casey," he whispered, and reached for her, wanting to wrap his arms around her, to hold her close, feel her warmth, smell her hair, but his eyes wouldn't stay open, and he was spinning, further and further away. "Wait, let me see how badly you're injured." "Oh, dear Christ, Trace!" He heard her sharp intake of breath, and saw that she was focused on the dead woman lying next to him. "Oh, my God! Who?" she whispered. Then, clearing her throat, she moved close to the woman, who was nearly her twin. Leaning over the body, she searched for a pulse at the woman's neck, pushed her ear next to her nostrils. "Gone," she whispered, then dragged her gaze from the body that was so like her own. Touching him on the shoulder, she said gently, "We have to get you to a hospital." He was drifting away, his eyelids leaden. "But Eli," he forced out. "Where's Eli?" "I don't know," she said softly, holding him close. He drank in the smell of her, felt her warm, wet cheek against his own, as the wintry world, like one of those snow globes turned upside down, seemed to spin around him. "No," he said, fighting to stay conscious. He had to find his son. Had to. "We'll find him," she promised over the shattering wail of sirens. "You just hang in, you hear me? Trace! Trace! You just stay with me." But he didn't. 1 second he heard her voice, the next he was floating away, wondering how this woman he loved could be two, one dead, one alive. He sank into himself, heard voices, men and women, couldn't respond. "Casey's alive. She's alive. But Eli," he loved them both. "Don't you leave me, Trace O'Halloran," she yelled at him from somewhere far off. "Damn it, Trace! It took me 35 years to find you, and you better not die on me. Do you hear me? Stay with me." Her voice broke. "Come on, Trace, come on! I love you! Oh, holy Christ, I love you!" "I love you too," he thought. She was losing him. Right here, right now, Trace O'Halloran was dying in her arms. And the woman lying next to him, dead in the snow, she was now certain must be Leanna, his ex-wife, probably another one of Gerald Johnson's sperm bank children, and mother to Eli. "Hang in there," she ordered Trace, as the sound of sirens blasted around them and lights bobbed up the driveway. She didn't look over her shoulder, but prayed the EMTs had the equipment to save him. He'd lost a lot of blood, but she wasn't going to let him die. Not on her watch. Quickly she stripped him of his pants, yanking out the flashlight from her pocket to get a good look at the bullet wound in his thigh. Blood was pumping out of the hole in his flesh, and she suspected his femoral artery had been hit. She crossed one hand over the other and pressed them to the wound just as she heard, "Hey, over here!" from a deep voice yelling near the house. Then footsteps and heaving breaths and conversation swirled around her in the snow. "We'll take over, ma'am," someone said, and she felt a man's hand on her shoulder. "But I'm a doctor." "Holy Christ, there's another one!" He started bending over Leanna's body. "She's dead." "Hey, over here!" a woman shouted from the vicinity of Cam's corpse. "Holy shit, what happened here? Looks like goddamned Armageddon." "Here, ma'am, I've got him now," the EMT said, turning back to Trace. "But I'm a doctor, I know." He was firm. "Hey, Annie," he called over his shoulder, as Casey was vaguely aware of colored lights strobing the night, red and blue flashes through the ever-falling snow. "I could use some help over here. This one's in shock," the EMT said, and glanced up at Casey. The O'Halloran ranch was a madhouse. All hell had broken loose before Alvarez and Pescoli arrived, their jeep sliding around the corner at the end of the drive and nearly taking out the mailbox. 2 department-issued vehicles were parked near an open gate, and an ambulance, too, idled, waiting to transport the injured. At the back of the big farmhouse, while battling the elements, EMTs were tending to Trace O'Halloran, strapping him to a stretcher while a search team had been dispatched to find O'Halloran's missing son. Cameron Johnson, dressed in black and wearing night goggles, was dead from 2 gunshot wounds, inflicted, admittedly, by Casey Lambert. Shivering, a blanket thrown around her shoulders, Casey herself admitted to cutting him down when he refused to drop his weapon. Pale as death, obviously in shock, Casey swore that Cameron had already killed the woman still lying in the snow in front of them. A woman who could have been her twin. "I think it's Leanna," Casey said, almost numbly, her gaze fastened on the woman's frozen features. "Dead," one of the EMTs confirmed. "I need to go with him," Casey insisted as 2 burly rescue workers carried Trace on a stretcher through the piling snow to the waiting ambulance. "You can ride with us," Pescoli said. "Hey!" Trilby Vandroz, one of the road deputies, cocked her head toward the main road. "Looks like we've got company." Twin headlights glowed at the end of the drive, but Pescoli couldn't make out the vehicle. "5 will get you 1, it's the press." A news van. Of course, great, just what they didn't need. "They have to back off, "Until we know what went down," Pescoli shouted, and Van Droz began heading down the lane, following the tracks of the ambulance that carried Trace. "I think O'Halloran is going to be okay," Alvarez said. "But Eli, we have to find him," Casey insisted. "Leanna, I thought she was in the house with me, warning me, but the timing probably couldn't be. I thought she was an angel." Pescoli glanced at her partner. "Let's have a doctor look at her, too." "I'm fine," Casey insisted, but her face was pretty bruised, the skin scraped, her chin covered in blood. "Okay, let's go," Pescoli said. As the ambulance sped off through the snow, Pescoli, Alvarez, and Casey trudged through the drifts to the jeep. Casey climbed into the back seat. Her car was still in the police garage, the black paint transferred from her fender bender, not yet analyzed. Alvarez settled into the passenger seat, and Pescoli backed up, then rammed the jeep into gear. Even though Cam Johnson was dead, Pescoli still felt a sense of urgency, and the missing kid didn't help. Where the hell could he be, she wondered as she flipped on the lights and hit the gas. There were too many loose ends to be tied up, too much evidence to be collected, other stories that had to jibe with what Casey was saying before Pescoli would be satisfied. Even though the doctor was half mad with worry about the boy's whereabouts, and beyond concern that Trace O'Halloran might not make it, Alvarez and Pescoli were required to haul her to the station. After their trip to the emergency room. True, Pescoli thought as she drove onto the county road and saw the news team from a local station huddled in their van. Casey Lambert had called 911, as well as left Alvarez several voicemail messages on her phone. It had been the doctor who had drawn the authorities to the scene, but she hadn't played by the book, had ignored the 911 dispatcher's advice, and taken the law into her own hands. Had she saved O'Halloran's life? Probably. But 2 other people were dead, and a kid was still missing. The sketchy statement Casey had given coincided with everything the crime scene guys had put together so far, but it was too early in the game. They still had to cross all the T's and dot all the I's. She headed toward Grizzly Falls. The night was dark aside from the snow. Only a few farmhouses in the area, those with generators, showing any light in the windows. Tow trucks had stopped for a vehicle that had slid into the ditch, and other traffic was slow, battling the storm. Pescoli had the heater working overtime, the interior of the Jeep as hot as a sauna, yet Casey Lambert couldn't seem to get warm, and was shivering as she told her story for the second time, then worried aloud about Eli. "If anything happens to him, I'll never forgive myself," she said, and stared out the window, her breath fogging the glass. Never. 2 minutes later, just as they reached the snow-covered sign welcoming all to Grizzly Falls, Alvarez's cell phone jangled. She took the call and listened, the conversation one-sided. "What? Where? Thank God." She twisted in the passenger seat. "We've got him." "What? Who? Eli?" Casey demanded. "Yes, ma'am, he's safe." "Thank God." Casey's voice broke. She sniffed loudly. Pescoli's hands held the wheel in a death grip, but she felt a rush of relief, a dam of fear breaking inside her. "Shh!" Alvarez held up a hand and finished the call. "Yeah, well, bring him into the office. We'll meet you there." She hung up, and even her usually icy, all-professional facade cracked. "He's fine." Pescoli glanced in the rearview mirror and saw tears of happiness well in her passenger's eyes. "Okay," Alvarez went on. "I don't know all the details, but it looks like he was kidnapped by his mother, dropped off at the neighbors Ed and Matilda Zukof's house, and they've been trying to reach someone ever since. Apparently Leanna O'Halloran cut their phone line and stole their cells to give herself time to fulfill some mission." "She was after Cam," Casey said quietly. "She knew." "Apparently," Alvarez agreed. "We'll be getting more information from the Zukofs. An officer is bringing them into the station, along with the boy." Pescoli grimaced against the glare of particularly bright high beams as a truck rumbled past. So she was out of the picture for most of the kid's life. Then she suddenly, in what, some kind of cosmic mother instinct, rolls into town at just the right moment to blow some nutcase away? Pescoli shot a look at her partner. What did she know? Alvarez shook her head. They might never fully figure it out. Casey went over her statement 3 times and answered a slew of questions. Though it was obvious Pescoli and Alvarez, and even the sheriff himself, believed her. They'd planned on taking her directly to the hospital, but she'd insisted on getting the interview at the sheriff's department over with first. As soon as they got there, she took time to head to the bathroom, wash her face, down 3 migraine-strength Excedrin, and use a slightly too large Band-Aid that the woman at reception had given her on her chin. She'd called the hospital on Trace's cell, but had only learned that Trace was in surgery. Deputy Vandroz brought the Zhukovs and Eli into the room where Casey was being interviewed, just as Casey had finished another run-through of the events that had taken place at the O'Halloran Ranch. She threw her arms around the boy, tears filling her eyes. "Thank God you're safe," she whispered fervently and ruffled his hair. "I saw Mommy," Eli said, biting his lower lip. "I know, honey. She came to pick me up." "I heard," Casey answered, with a smile that was difficult to muster. Seeing Leanna on the snowy ground, her face gray in the half-light, her eyes fixed, had been like staring into her own grave. "She signed my cast," he stated proudly. Casey glanced up at Tilly, who nodded while Ed looked away. Proudly, Eli displayed the bold scrawl that said, "Love you, Mom, XOXO." "It's beautiful," she said, remembering how Leanna had saved them all. She wondered if she'd really heard Leanna's voice, or if it had merely been a hallucination. It hardly mattered, for either way she intended to take really good care of Leanna's son. "Want some hot cocoa?" Pescoli asked Eli, who, after glancing at Casey and the Zhukovs and receiving hearty "yes, go-aheads," eagerly followed after the taller, red-haired detective. Once the boy was gone, the Zhukovs told their tale. Leanna had showed up at their house carrying Eli. She apparently trudged through the snow to deliver her son, and then she disabled their truck and landline and stolen their cell phones. She'd also taken their computer, so that they had no means of communicating with anyone, while she said she was taking care of some unfinished business. Tilly went on to say that Leanna had admitted that she knew about the killer, who was taking out all the daughters of Gerald Johnson, as he believed most of them had serious mental problems. He was intent on protecting his family name, and made up an elaborate plan to take care of the problem. He also had a personal vendetta against Casey and Leanna, because he'd fallen for Leanna, not knowing who she was, and he despised Casey as well for being born to Gerald's mistress. He had bad feelings for Robert Lindley, too, but until he'd eradicated all of the unknowings, as he'd called them, he would take his time with Robert. During the recitation, Casey recalled Cameron's taunts after he'd hit her with the rifle butt. He'd believed she and Leanna and the rest of Gerald's female offspring weren't mentally sound, when his own mental illness was the reason he'd targeted all of them. Tilly wound up by adding that Cameron had admitted his deadly deeds to Leanna when he tried to kill her years before, but she'd gotten away and found Trace. She'd left her son with Trace, fearing Cameron would take his sick vengeance upon Eli, but her fear for Eli was the reason she came back, to save the boy everyone assumed she'd abandoned, and to stop Cameron in his tracks. "We were horrified," Tilly finished, "and trapped. We wanted Eli to be safe, but we were worried sick about you all. Ed even tried to start the old John Deere in hopes of getting to the Foxes, our neighbors to the north, and calling the police. Dang thing wouldn't even turn over in the cold," Ed admitted. Both he and his wife looked worn out and beleaguered. Pescoli returned with Eli, who was interested in poking at the fake marshmallows floating in his hot chocolate. She also brought several cups of steaming coffee. Casey took one, more for the warmth than anything else. She turned to Ed and Tilly, softly asking the question that was now haunting her. "So, Eli is Cameron's son?" "Not according to her. She was very adamant on that," Tilly said, and Ed nodded his agreement. "I'm my dad's son," Eli put in, blowing across his cocoa. "Of course you are." Casey walked across the room and hugged him fiercely, sorry he'd overheard her. She thought he was out of earshot. She was so glad that he was safe. She would have to deal with his questions about his mother, she knew that, but she was willing to do it, to be with him and to be with Trace. Her feelings about Leanna were torn, but she couldn't deny that the woman had sacrificed herself for the sake of her son. Alvarez's cell phone jangled, and she looked at the screen. "I've got to take this," she said, before walking into an adjoining room. She was gone about 10 minutes, and when she returned, she said, "Looks like we can convict Cameron Johnson for more crimes than we know. The team who went to his house found a secret room down in the basement. There are pictures of the victims, information about each of them, many already dead, some who escaped." Casey thought of Gloria Sanders O'Malley, the fitness instructor. "I'm going to have to call Jonas Hayes in L.A., Alvarez said to Pescoli. "I think we can tie Cam Johnson to Shelley Bonaventure's supposed suicide." "He was the creep who attacked me in Seattle," Casey said. "He admitted as much." She sighed and shook her head. "If we're done here, can I get a ride to the hospital?" Pescoli nodded. "I'll drive." Turning to Eli, Casey said with a smile, "Come on, let's go see your dad." As it turned out, Casey wasn't alone in wanting to go to the hospital. Pescoli and Alvarez planned to question Trace when he woke up, and Ed and Tilly, though tired, drove to St. Bart's as well. But being back in the familiar hospital halls was a little surreal for Casey. Though everything looked the way it had the last time she'd been here, after all she'd been through, it seemed different, changed. She told herself that it was because of the fact she'd been hit in the back of the head with the butt of a rifle. But it was more, a deeper disconnect that all had to do with meeting a murderer face to face and killing him. Though she felt no regret for taking Cameron Johnson's life, as he'd intended to murder Trace, she still felt out of step. She dedicated her professional life to helping heal, to save lives, and now she'd purposefully taken one. Shake it off, she told herself, and after leading a protesting Eli with Tilly and Ed, made her way to the recovery room, as she was a doctor on staff. Alvarez and Pescoli were right behind her, but hung back to give her a second's privacy when she headed to the bed where Trace lay. He was just coming around and woozy, his leg bandaged, his hospital gown askew. His leg had been saved, the femoral artery nicked but repaired. He moaned, his head dark against the white sheets. He blinked, slowly awake. "Hey there," she said, leaning over his bed, as the recovery room nurse stepped away to allow them some privacy. With obvious effort, he tried to focus. "It's me." She took his hand, and her heart squeezed at the sight of him, his hair rumpled on the pillow, his jaw dark with beard shadow. God, she loved him, and for a few harrowing minutes she thought she'd lost him forever. "Trace?" One side of his mouth lifted in a dopey grin, but his eyes were far from clear. "Casey?" he said, his voice rough. "Yeah, it's me." Her throat nearly closed as his grip tightened over hers. "Eli?" he whispered. "He's fine." Tears burned the back of her eyes. "And he's here, waiting to see you. He's with the Zukofs just down the hall." He seemed relieved, then goofy again. "Oh, Tilly, Ed." "Yes." She knew he wouldn't remember much about waking up, maybe nothing, but she couldn't help herself from squeezing his hand. "Trace, "I need to tell you something," she said. He was drifting again. "First of all, Leanna turned out to be okay. More than okay. I think she saved your life." He didn't respond. Probably hadn't heard. "And there's something else," she admitted, leaning close over the bed. "I love you." She smiled, though she felt warm tears slide down her face. "It's crazy, and I know it, but damn it, I love you." "I know." His voice was far away. "You're gonna marry me." He was still out of it, didn't know what he was saying, but it filled her heart with joy. We'll talk about it when you're better." His eyes opened suddenly, and in that split second his gaze was clear. "I am better," he said, and reached up quickly, his fingers sliding around her nape, as he lifted his head from the pillow and pulled her close so that their noses were nearly touching. "And you're going to marry me, Dr. Lambert." Before she could say a word, he pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was as crushing as it was desperate. "No arguments," he said, when he finally released her and fell back on the sheets, spent, his eyes closing again. "Faker," she accused. He didn't respond. She felt a smile tug on his swollen lips, and she didn't say it, but thought, "I am going to marry you, Trace O'Halloran. Count on it." Epilogue. Come on, we're going to go caroling." Joelle, wearing ridiculous red felt reindeer antlers, was herding everyone into the lobby. Pescoli looked up from her desk, where she was studying the death certificates and newspaper reports on the two sisters of Cameron Johnson, who had died young, in accidents. "I am not caroling. I've got work to do." "Oh, don't be a Scrooge," Joelle admonished, before clipping off in her clear high heels that looked like something Barbie would wear. Well, and Michelle, yeah, Lucky's young wife, would love those heels. It was only a week until Christmas, and Joelle was really ramped up for the holiday. Christmas music and cookies and garlands, and even the spinning tree with its fake presents stacked beneath it. What more could one woman do to a government office? Not that Pescoli paid much attention. She'd had more than enough to deal with in her own life. For starters, Santana was pressuring her big time. It turned out that Brady Long had left him part of his immense estate, and Nate thought she and her children and the dog should move in with him. As if it were just that easy. Nope, she thought, clicking through the computer screens. She wasn't convinced, though a father figure for her kids certainly wouldn't hurt. Jeremy, sick of her nagging and bored with his life, had finally agreed to go back to school come January, and Pescoli was crossing her fingers that he wouldn't change his mind again. As for his involvement with Heidi Brewster, it was still simmering, but the kids were somehow keeping it on the down low, which may or may not be a good thing, depending on how you looked at it. Bianca, well enough to go back to school, had actually started talking to some other boy who'd stopped by a couple of times. Some kid on the basketball team who actually called her Ms. Pescoli, rather than ignoring her. Chris was still hanging out, of course, but it definitely looked like that particular romance was dying on the vine, and none too soon. For the entire Secret Santa debacle, Pescoli had decided to play along and give the under-sheriff a bottle of wine with its own little knit stocking cap that Joelle Pescoli was certain would do backflips over. Pescoli herself found it kind of gaggy, but she couldn't come up with anything else. The Oregon Pinot Noir had been on a special sale, keeping under the $10 limit, and in Pescoli's mind the gift was a bit of an olive branch. At least that's what she hoped. After all, she had to work for the prick. So life was looking up, except for Alvarez, who had sunk into her usual Christmas funk. There was something going on with her, just like every other holiday season. She never returned home to Oregon for Christmas, and this year she said she'd planned to work over the holiday and let the people with families have the time off. When invited to Pescoli's, she declined, claiming she wanted to spend her free time with Jane Doe, her newly adopted cat. Pescoli had tried to ask her partner about her avoidance of all things to do with Yuletide, but Alvarez, as ever, managed to evade the questions or change the subject. Christmas, as far as Alvarez was concerned, was a taboo topic. Pescoli glanced out the window, noticed it was still snowing. At least, though, the storms had slowed, and the workload at the department was back to a more normal level. As for Cameron Johnson, a sicko serial killer, if there ever had been one, the FBI had stepped in and taken all of the files, notes, and computer information from Johnson's secret room in the basement of his house, and were working the case. It seemed Cameron had been hell-bent on eradicating the female offspring of donor 727 for years. In his notes, the deputies had found reference to 42 women, some who lived as far away as New England. DNA tests had proven the victims around this part of Montana, as well as others, including Shelley Bonaventure in L.A., had indeed been Gerald Johnson's offspring. Other accident victims, the unknowings named in Johnson's notes, who were already dead, were being examined. If there were any DNA samples taken before they were buried, they were being compared, or the bodies were now being exhumed. They would probably never know about the few who had been cremated, as there was no DNA left behind to be tested. There was other physical evidence that tied Cameron Johnson to his crimes as well. The black paint on Casey's Ford and Ellie Alexander's minivan had matched the custom-made, spray-painted bumper guard that had been hidden in a shed and fit perfectly on Johnson's truck. A cache of stolen plates had been located, which explained some of the difficulty they had had in IDing the damn truck. Pescoli leaned back in her chair until it squeaked in protest, and she heard, muted softly, the sound of voices raised in song. "I heard the bells on Christmas Day." Pescoli checked her watch. It was almost showtime, and the stage was set. A few things about the case still bothered Pescoli, and scraped at her brain, tickling her into believing there had to be more than they'd already unearthed, even though all leads pointed to Cameron Johnson. As Casey Lambert had insisted, Pescoli believed that Johnson had been the man who had attacked her in the parking garage in Seattle years before, and now rumor had it the good doctor might be moving in with Trace O'Halloran, just like that, when Pescoli couldn't commit to a man she'd been in love with for years. Now Pescoli closed her eyes for a moment and sighed, thinking hard, running over the loose ends. She was pretty sure she had it figured out. Cameron Johnson had been a whack job with a capital W, no doubt about that. Also, he'd definitely been unraveling, more and more taking risks. But that didn't explain everything. How had he gotten all the information on the clinic and the victims? Had he really uncovered that information himself? She didn't think so. Another thing. It looked like Leanne O'Halloran had stolen the gun that she'd used that night, and that gun was Clarissa Werner's. Pescoli had interviewed Clarissa and her husband, and they both believed Leanna had specifically taken it as a kind of up yours to the Johnson clan as a whole. And it looked like Leanne O'Halloran's special touch of irony was that she drove a BMW, same make and model as Clarissa's, to also point a finger in the Johnsons' direction. Maybe. Or maybe not. But there were other issues about the case that needed to still be addressed. Glancing at her watch again, Pescoli made a sound of impatience. Alvarez looked up, her brows lifted. Earlier in the day, while they were grabbing coffee at Jolt, she asked her, "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "Nope." Pescoli had sprung for a triple chocolate mocha with a sprinkle of peppermint, just because it was the holidays. Alvarez had ordered green tea. Disgusting. But Alvarez had been interested then, as she was now. "What are you planning?" she asked. I've already done it. Gerald Johnson is coming in about 15 minutes, and I think he's bringing his favorite attorney. Judd? Mm-hmm. And I've got a surprise for him. Can't wait, she said. Come on then, Pescoli said, and Alvarez followed her to the front desk. Right on cue, Gerald and Judd strode into the department. Judd was dressed as if he were going to try a case in court. Gerald in a sweater, ski jacket, jeans, and a world-weary expression. I don't understand why you insisted on coming here, Judd was saying to his father. He glanced at Pescoli and added, I've told you everything I know about my brother. Pescoli led them into an interrogation room, and Judd stiffened. What's this about? He demanded. The truth. Pescoli turned on the recorder. I've been doing some checking. A few things still don't add up. Maybe you can clarify them. Be glad to, Gerald said. Judd wasn't as helpful. Dad, he warned his father, his expression brooking no argument, I don't think this is a good idea. Pescoli ignored him and waved them into the side chairs as Alvarez closed the door behind them. When we were talking about Aggie's accident years ago, there was some discussion, Pescoli began. You said she got tangled in her blankets and tripped and fell down the stairs. No, Judd said. I remember Cameron brushing up against her and she fell. No one could catch her. You also said that she was pushed, Pescoli reminded, from her chair across from them. Well, it was a little of both, I think. Judd's eyes narrowed and his shoulders stiffened slightly. I don't understand. I do, Gerald said. I came home that night and Cameron was really upset. He said he didn't mean to do it, that he didn't want to push Aggie, but he couldn't help himself. I didn't understand it. Then Thane's version was slightly different. He said that you, Judd, ran into Cameron and he fell against Aggie. And Colt said you pushed Cam into Aggie, but Cam was able to save himself. We were kids, Judd explained with a shrug. It was a long time ago. You can't expect any of us to recall exactly what happened. Pescoli walked to the door and opened it again. Clarissa Johnson-Werner stepped inside. They called me in, she said as a kind of sideways apology to her brother, but nevertheless stated firmly. You're wrong. I remember. I was there. What is this? Judd demanded. You've been listening in? Watching on a monitor, she said tersely. And you're lying. I saw what happened that day, and you were behind it, Judd. You probably didn't mean for Aggie to fall down the stairs, but you shoved Cameron hard, and he fell against her. I was on the phone, coming out to check, and you pushed him. Where is this going? Judd demanded tensely. It was an accident. Kids roughhousing. But he was beginning to sweat, a tiny bead drizzling down his temple. And then on the ski slopes, when Kathleen died, Clarissa went on determinedly. You were there, skiing with Cam and Kathy. I saw you talking to them, and later Cam told me you dared him to race Kathy and to go off trail, where the snow wasn't groomed. You told him that Kathy, like Aggie, wasn't normal, that she was crazy, when really Cam was the one who wasn't balanced. What are you talking about? Judd said, the sweat now collecting on his upper lip. This is crazy, nuts, old news, and I'm not going to listen to this a second longer. Pescoli was expecting his reaction. She said evenly, My partner and I intend to get to the bottom of this. We know Cameron was the killer, and maybe he acted alone, but it seems to me he had some help. And at first I thought it was his twin, Colt. What better alibi? But then I discovered that your father's corporation, under the guise of several different companies, bought out the old fertility clinic. And guess whose name is all over the documents? Judd didn't flinch. We buy a lot of companies, especially small medical facilities. Pescoli leaned back in her chair. You want to tell us just what your relationship was with your brother, Cameron? My brother was crazy. And one sister was mentally challenged, another bipolar. Huh. Looks like mental problems aren't just limited to the women your father sired. I think it only makes sense that Cameron had someone helping him along, giving him a little mental shove, you might say. You're the one who's out of her mind, Detective. Judd's face flushed red, his one hand clenched into a fist. He kicked out his chair and walked to the door. This interview is over. We'll be seeing you, Mr. Johnson, Pescoli said. The hell you will. He slammed out of the room, and Gerald, looking deeply concerned, followed a few moments later, with Clarissa taking up the rear. When they were alone, Pescoli turned to Alvarez and said, Well? Alvarez half smiled. Well, we're going to nail him, aren't we? Count on it. They walked out of the room together, and Alvarez glanced up at Pescoli as they reached the hallway. Another Merry Christmas, partner. Another Merry Christmas.
The End. You've been listening to Born to Die by Lisa Jackson, narrated by Alan Nebelthaw. If you've enjoyed this book and this performance, Recorded Books recommends Sister by Rosamund Lupton, narrated by Juanita McMahon. When Bea hears from her mother that Tess, her younger sister, is missing, she books the first flight she can back to London. She fully expects to find Tess and give her the usual lecture, the bossy big sister scolding her flighty younger sibling for taking off without letting anyone know her plans. But Tess is found dead after an apparent suicide. And while her family and the police accept the sad reality, Bea is convinced that Tess has been murdered. In her single-minded search for a killer, she moves into Tess's apartment and throws herself headlong into her sister's life and all its secrets. But the more she finds out, the more it may put her own life at risk. You'll find a wide selection of titles in the Recorded Books catalog, including bestsellers, mysteries, classics, histories, and more. Call us toll-free or log on to recordedbooks.com to learn about our latest releases and special offers, order another recorded book, or to read author interviews and narrator profiles. Don't forget to ask about easy 30-day rentals by mail. And thank you for being a Recorded Books reader.
Detective Jonas Hayes of the LAPD wasn't buying the setup. He hadn't last night when he'd responded to the call to Shelley Bonaventure's apartment, and he didn't today as he sat at his desk and clicked through the images of the crime scene on his computer. This morning the department was buzzing, phones ringing, conversations drifting from one desk to the next, footsteps, shuffling, computer keys clicking, and somewhere a printer was clunking out copies. Hayes took a swallow of his coffee, a cup he'd picked up at the Starbucks a few streets down, as he worked his way through the statements collected the night before. Again. He had perused them all around 4 in the morning, and now was reading them more slowly 5 hours later. Last night, from the minute he'd stepped through Shelley Bonaventure's front door, he'd been hit by the sensation that everything wasn't as it was portrayed. He felt as if this crime scene had been staged a la Marilyn Monroe some 50 years earlier. Half a century later there were still conspiracy theories, and the question of murder still hung over Marilyn's grave. He didn't want the same controversy to be a part of Shelley Bonaventure's death, not on his watch, and the crime scene just hadn't felt right last night. Still didn't. And that, in and of itself, was odd. A man of science, Hayes believed in cold, hard facts. He wasn't big into gut feelings or hunches. He believed that the truth of a crime was found in evidence. But this case was different. For one thing, he didn't believe that Shelley, no matter what her mental state, would call 911 while stark naked. If she'd had enough sense to make the call, then why not put on a robe at the very least? Was this a ploy for publicity? Did being nude ramp up the curiosity factor? Had she wanted to die sensationally?